Hey everyone, welcome back. When we left off, we were about halfway through our journey west along the grueling, dangerous Oregon Trail. It's a quest that, while often glorified today, is one that many would not have survived. Before we get going with part 2, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to make sure that you never miss any of my videos. And if you haven't listened to part 1, I've linked it in the description below. Now sit back, get comfortable and relax as we resume our journey along the Oregon Trail. After crossing the river and enduring your first major loss, you press onward into the Great Plains, which, for all their historical significance, are a peculiar combination of sublime and absurd. The landscape stretches endlessly, a vast expanse of grass and sky that hums quietly with its own unbothered rhythm. At first glance, it seems beautiful in the classic romantic sense, rolling waves of green, dotted occasionally by wildflowers that manage to survive the wind's endless enthusiasm, and a horizon so distant that it makes you question whether the earth is simply unwilling to end. Yet the beauty is deceptive. The plains are monotonous in ways that quietly erode the mind. Each day blends into the next, with subtle variations, of dust, grass, and sky, like a slow-motion optical illusion designed to test human patience. At dawn, the sun rises somewhere over the horizon, warm and insistent, lighting the endless prairie in soft golds and muted greens. By midday, it hangs overhead, relentless, baking the dust into your boots and sticking to the back of your neck, like a persistent sandy friend. And by dusk, the light softens once more, painting the landscape in a melancholy wash of pink and amber, a visual sigh that hints at beauty, but carries the faint sting of monotony. You begin to notice patterns in the plains. The grass moves uniformly with the wind, swaying in waves that are both mesmerizing and maddening. Birds flit about, rarely staying long enough to identify properly, and the occasional coyote passes by with a dignified air, evidently judging your choice to walk for miles in the dust without complaint. Even the clouds seem deliberate in their slow, tedious migration, offering shade at times and at others, nothing but the relentless blue of a sky that refuses to break. It is during these long stretches that you become intimately acquainted with the mental gymnastics of monotony. You count fence posts that do not exist. You attempt to sketch distant hills or a passing bison, only to discover that they refuse to pose or remain still. You invent imaginary conversations with oxen, who respond with a calm indifference that borders on philosophical contempt. These exercises, you note, are essential for maintaining one's sanity. The Great Plains are not merely a landscape. They are a psychological trial designed to test your capacity for quiet endurance. Historical anecdotes about the plains come to mind as you trudge forward. The diaries of pioneers often note the beauty, always noting it first, before descending into the practical horrors of dust, heat, and a general sense of existential boredom. One diarist writes, "The plains are lovely, so lovely in fact that I wonder why I am alive, my boots full of dust, and my lunch floating in the river from yesterday." Another notes that the monotony inspired a small outbreak of panic, creatively described as boredom-induced madness, wherein travelers lost all interest in careful rationing or dignified speech. Your own experience reflects these truths. Dust infiltrates every crevice, your boots, your coat, the folds of your bedroll, and, if you are not careful, even the contents of your journal. It sticks to skin and hair, forming a subtle patina of pioneer experience that is both honorable and irritating. Wind, the unrelenting companion of the plains, sculpts the dust into miniature storms that sweep over camp at night, a gentle but persistent reminder that the prairie does not care about your comfort, dignity, or need for sleep. Buffalo appear, occasionally massive and distant, grazing with an air of casual authority. You attempt to sketch them for posterity, for pride, or simply to occupy your mind, but they refuse to cooperate. They move with their own rhythms, ignoring your efforts entirely. Their presence is majestic, yes, but also a stark reminder that you are a minor, awkward element in a world that was designed to proceed without your consent or cooperation. You notice the way your fellow travelers adapt to the plains. Conversations shorten. Complaints are delivered with dry, understated tones. There is a communal understanding that exaggeration is unnecessary. Everyone is tired, dusty, and aware that the landscape will continue stretching long after dinner, long after the river, and long after the occasional misfortune. Humor becomes essential. Jokes about dust, blisters, and oxen philosophies circulate quietly, offering the faintest relief from the psychological weight of endless green and sky. The plains are also a place for reflection, though not the kind encouraged in polite drawing rooms. Thoughts wander in peculiar directions. How many miles can one walk before shoes cease to be shoes and simply become protective layers of dust? What exactly is the nutritional value of a single soggy hardtack after it has spent hours in the back of a wagon? Why do oxen insist on chewing precisely when the wagon lurches most precariously? Questions abound, few of them answerable, but each contributes to the meditative rhythm of the journey. And then there is the prairie soundscape, the constant swish of wind through grass, the low, repetitive murmur of oxen chewing, the occasional, distant call of birds, the soft, almost imperceptible groaning of wagons under weight and strain. It is a lullaby, though one that might lull you to philosophical despair as much as sleep. You become attuned to it, listening for deviations that might signal danger. A predator, a misbehaving ox, or simply the onset of another dust storm. Dust storms themselves are a particular delight of the plains. They arrive unannounced, a swirling granular curtain that reduces visibility to a few feet and coats everything in a dry, sandy layer that seems impossible to remove. You gag, sneeze, and generally question why humans ever decided that traversing the prairie was a good idea. And yet, when the storm passes, the sky is startlingly clear, the colors of the prairie are vivid, and the sense of small, personal achievement, surviving the dust storm without losing your lunch or your dignity, is surprisingly satisfying. Cholera outbreaks, you learn from scattered historical notes, were a not uncommon concern across the plains. Travelers wrote about them in hushed, almost matter-of-fact tones. A disease that strikes with efficiency and subtlety, often exacerbated by dust, heat, and the general impossibility of maintaining any hygiene whatsoever. Madness induced by boredom and disease often walks hand in hand, leading to some remarkably dark, sometimes absurd, diary entries. You note these carefully because knowing how others failed might help you avoid similar pitfalls, or at least provide a darkly amusing anecdote for your own journal. By evening, after hours of walking, adjusting harnesses, swatting at flies, and dodging particularly obstinate clumps of buffalo, you arrive at another campsite. The ground is dry and dusty, your clothing layered in prairie sediment, and the fire is lit with some difficulty thanks to the persistent wind. Oxen settle, chewing quietly, giving you the sense that they are contemplating the human condition, a condition they find both puzzling and mildly amusing. Lying down on your bedroll, you reflect on the day. The plains have revealed their dual nature, breathtaking in vastness and subtly horrifying in monotony, beautiful in their simplicity and cruel in their unyielding sameness. Dust coats everything. Wind carries a perpetual reminder that you are not the master of this landscape. Oxen chew. Birds do whatever birds do, and you modestly question each decision that led you to this point, while simultaneously marveling at the strange, unbroken rhythm of life on the prairie. And so you drift toward sleep, boots dusty, clothes stiff, and hair perpetually tangled with prairie grit. The wind murmurs softly through the grass. The oxen chew with gentle philosophical patience, and the sound of distant wagons settling into camp forms a subtle, meditative lullaby. You are small, slightly defeated, and utterly human, a solitary participant in the monotonous, eternal beauty of the Great Plains. The sun rises once again over the endless horizon, a silent tyrant illuminating every inch of prairie with its unsympathetic brilliance. You groan as you roll out of your bedroll, stiff from sleeping on uneven ground and damp from the prairie. Dew that the dust inevitably mingled with overnight. The oxen are already awake, chewing rhythmically and staring at you as though judging your level of competence. a judgment you have begun to respect for its accuracy. Long days on the plains are measured not in hours but in incremental annoyances. The dust begins its slow invasion at dawn, seeping into boots, clothing, and hair. By mid-morning, every surface has been subtly coated in a fine layer of grit. Lunch, if you can call it that, is eaten with a mouthful of prairie dust, and somehow, despite repeated attempts at dignity, your hands are perpetually coated in it as well. By the time the sun has reached its zenith, morale tends to wobble on the brink of collapse, and tempers predictably follow. Disagreements arise over trivial matters with remarkable frequency. Someone insists that the oxen should follow a slightly different route, prompting arguments that would be laughable if exhaustion and dust had not heightened the stakes. Another argues that the wagon should rest for 5 more minutes, provoking a near-civil conflict over time management and minor leadership authority. You find yourself muttering quietly under your breath, practicing a dry, sarcastic commentary on humanity, which is the only outlet that preserves your sanity. Buffalo, those great and magnificent beasts, wander across the prairie in clusters, indifferent to your suffering. You attempt bravely to sketch them, hoping to capture a fleeting moment of grandeur for posterity, or perhaps just to occupy the mind during another long, dusty march. The buffalo have, of course, no interest in participating. They graze slowly, amble away when approached, or turn their broad-horned faces toward you with a sort of bemused tolerance, as if to say, "Yes, human, continue your futile artistry. It amuses us." This combination of long, physically grueling days and small, persistent irritations begins to test the psychological fabric of your group. Conversations shorten to terse statements. Humor, though still present, becomes dry, understated, and often sarcastic. Jokes revolve around minor misfortunes, lost hats, oxen that refuse to obey, and the seemingly endless march through unbroken grass and sky. A sense of camaraderie emerges, forged in the shared understanding that irritation and exhaustion are universal, inescapable, and best endured with subtle wit. Occasionally, there are moments of genuine awe. You catch sight of a distant herd of bison, their forms monumental against the horizon. The sight inspires a fleeting sense of grandeur, a reminder that the plains are indeed magnificent, even if their beauty comes at the cost of constant labor and mental endurance. You marvel at the creature's size, their indifference, and the ease with which they traverse terrain that has reduced you to aching muscles and sore feet. You sketch hurriedly, only for them to wander out of frame before a single line can capture their majesty. Heat and sun intensify the monotony. By afternoon, sweat mixes with dust, forming a gritty paste that clings to your skin. Water rations are precious and breaks are brief. You begin to notice the peculiar physiological effects of sustained exposure. Muscles ache in unfamiliar ways, concentration wanes, and even minor annoyances seem amplified to nearly cosmic proportions. A snapped twig, a wandering ox, or a momentary gust of wind can provoke groans of genuine despair. Yet in the midst of exhaustion, there is humor. You discover the absurdity of arguments over trivial decisions. Which route to take, whether to rest an ox, or whose turn it is to guard supplies. Each quarrel, each minor annoyance is endured with a measure of dry wit and sardonic commentary. You note mentally that humor, perhaps more than any other skill, is a crucial survival mechanism on the plains. Without it, the combination of physical labor, dust, and unyielding horizon would be unbearable. Buffalo, still unconcerned with your artistic ambitions, wander closer. One particularly large specimen stares directly at you, chewing slowly, and you swear it is mentally cataloging your failures. You consider capturing its likeness with ink and paper, but the creature moves, shifts, and eventually ambles off, leaving you with only a vague impression of power, patience, and a subtle rebuke for your presumption. The exercise is humbling, and you make a note to try again tomorrow, with perhaps less expectation of cooperation from the local wildlife. Cholera and boredom-induced madness, whispered about in diaries and scattered historical accounts, are never far from the mind. You note the psychological strain of the days stretching endlessly, punctuated by minor misfortunes, dust storms, and the occasional rogue buffalo. Travelers occasionally mutter about faint nausea, minor fevers, or a sudden, irrational desire to sprint into the nearest river. These observations are sobering reminders that the plains test not only your body, but your mental resilience. Evening brings a slight reprieve. The sun dips low, painting the prairie in warm amber and rose hues. Camp is set. Oxen rest and chew quietly. Supplies are checked, tents arranged, and meals prepared in the faint light. Conversation resumes in low, tired tones, often reflecting on the day's frustrations, the buffalo that refused to pose, or the minor triumphs of successfully navigating treacherous patches of prairie grass. Laughter is soft, ironic, and strangely comforting, a testament to human adaptability in the face of monotony and exhaustion. You lie in your bedroll, boots still coated in fine prairie dust, skin sticky with heat and perspiration, and listen to the faint, constant rhythm of oxen chewing, the occasional distant grunt of buffalo, and the whisper of wind through the grass. Thoughts drift toward questions both practical and philosophical. How far can one walk before exhaustion overwhelms reason? How many buffalo must be observed before humility is truly learned? Why, you wonder, do humans continue to persist in environments that are simultaneously awe-inspiring and cruelly monotonous? And yet, despite the dust, the long hours, and the frequent irritation, there is a meditative quality to the plains. The endless grass, the distant horizon, the steady presence of oxen and wildlife, all combine to create a rhythm both hypnotic and subtly instructive. You understand that patience, humor, and careful observation are essential tools. You understand that monotony can be endured, even appreciated, with the right mindset. And you understand, perhaps most importantly, that even buffalo have their own agendas, which will not be adjusted for human vanity. As darkness finally settles, the Great Plains stretch endlessly around your camp. Stars appear in the sky, immense and indifferent. The wind whispers through the grass. The oxen chew with serene persistence. And you, dusty, tired, and mentally recalibrated to the peculiar demands of this environment, drift toward sleep. You are small human, slightly exasperated but quietly at peace, a participant in the vast eternal rhythm of the plains, learning once again that patience, humility, and a touch of humor are essential for survival. By the time you've been walking the plains for several days, a subtle, creeping awareness begins to settle in. The combination of relentless dust, monotonous scenery, and near-constant walking can produce effects more dangerous than mere blisters or sore muscles. Among these, two are particularly notorious: cholera outbreaks and what has been dryly described in some pioneer journals as boredom-induced madness. Both have a curious habit of striking precisely when least convenient, and both teach invaluable lessons in humility, patience, and self-preservation. Cholera, in its polite historical terminology, is a disease that respects neither rank, planning, nor careful rationing. Travelers noted in journals that its arrival was often sudden, accompanied by fever, diarrhea, and the slow, grim realization that the water sources you had relied upon were neither pure nor cooperative. One diarist described an outbreak as the polite murder of our digestive dignity, a sentiment you find increasingly accurate as you contemplate the water rations in your own wagon. The disease spread rapidly, often following the routes of wagon trains with a perverse sense of timing. Entire groups could find themselves incapacitated, some gravely so, while others survived by what seemed little more than luck. Cholera, combined with the already challenging conditions of the plains, heat, dust, fatigue, and the occasional bison-induced detour, contributed to the unnerving reality that even minor missteps could be fatal. You take a careful note to always boil water when possible, though the thought of doing so with the wind blowing relentlessly across dry prairie, grass fills you with a faint despair. And yet cholera is only half of the story. The other, subtler hazard is boredom-induced madness, a condition documented repeatedly in historical accounts and one that requires careful attention. Endless days of uniform scenery, the repetitive sound of oxen chewing, and the slow, ceaseless march across unbroken grasslands can lead to a disconcerting erosion of mental resilience. Travelers reported hallucinations, sudden urges to abandon the wagon for no reason, and compulsive counting of every prairie tuft, bird or insect within visible range. You too notice early signs. Conversations drift into repetitive loops. Minor misadventures, a crate falling, oxen refusing commands, dust seeping into every crevice, are exaggerated in your mind until they assume the proportions of epic disasters. You find yourself staring at distant hills, convinced they have moved, shifted, or perhaps developed a subtle malevolent intent. You whisper warnings to your oxen, who, predictably, ignore them with admirable calm. The combination of physical discomfort and mental strain produces peculiar behaviors in otherwise rational people. One man begins naming all the birds he sees, assigning them elaborate personalities and tragic backstories. A woman sketches the same distant buffalo repeatedly, despite its persistent refusal to remain in frame. Minor irritations, a splintered wagon board, a dusty meal, an uncooperative boot, are elevated to catastrophic significance. And yet with dry humor, you begin to recognize these tendencies in yourself, appreciating the human capacity for imaginative survival even under tedium. Historical accounts are rich with examples. One pioneer described a colleague as prone to wander off into the grass muttering about conspiracies of the clouds. Another noted that boredom-induced madness often coincided with minor misfortunes, leading to a cyclical deterioration of morale. Surprisingly, humor often emerged in these journals as a coping mechanism, with diarists commenting on the absurdity of human behaviors under the relentless monotony of the plains. You take this as tacit permission to laugh quietly at your own lapses, understanding that amusement is a crucial buffer against mental erosion. Even physical health is subtly impacted by this combination. Repetitive strain, minor dehydration, and the slow accumulation of dust in the respiratory system produce a general malaise. Travelers reported headaches, a persistent itch of skin, and an overarching sense of existential fatigue. You notice these signs creeping in, taking care to hydrate when possible, to rest during brief stops, and to acknowledge, silently with a wry smile, that the plains are effectively a mental and physical endurance test masquerading as scenery. The oxen, oblivious to human psychological nuances, continue to provide a steady rhythm. Their chewing, while initially soothing, gradually takes on the cadence of a metronome, marking the slow passage of each interminable day. You begin to recognize it as both a comfort and a subtle irritant, a constant reminder of the unchanging reality of the prairie. Yet in this repetition, there is also instruction, patience, careful observation, and acceptance of what cannot be changed. As you continue your march, you reflect on survival strategies noted by pioneers. Maintaining a sense of humor is vital. Reading, sketching, or inventing minor games can stave off mental collapse. Careful rationing, attention to water sources, and a respectful distance from disease vectors are essential for physical survival. And above all, acknowledgement of the monotony, combined with a willingness to accept it gracefully, proves indispensable. The plains do not bend to human desire. Humans must bend to the plains' rhythms, finding subtle joys in minor victories and quiet resilience in routine endurance. Evening brings relief, a slight cooling of the sun, a pause in the wind, and the opportunity to reflect. You set camp, checking oxen, wagons, and supplies with methodical care. Fellow travelers share quiet anecdotes of past misadventures, humorous exaggerations of minor misfortune, and warnings about the subtle traps of mental fatigue. You contribute, modestly, sharing observations about dust storms, wandering buffalo, and the subtle absurdity of a day spent walking the same green expanse endlessly. Laughter, subdued and dry, circulates through camp, binding everyone in an unspoken acknowledgement of shared endurance. Lying in your bedroll, ears filled with the low murmur of oxen and the gentle whistle of wind through the prairie grass, you contemplate both cholera and boredom-induced madness. Both are omnipresent, subtle, and insistent in their threats. Both are reminders of human vulnerability and the importance of vigilance, humor, and patience. You drift towards sleep with a renewed understanding that survival is as much a mental endeavor as a physical one, and that the Great Plains, in all their eternal dust and unyielding monotony, are both teacher and test. In this meditative state, the wind murmurs through the grass, the oxen chew with steady determination, and distant buffalo wander through the fading light. You recognize the strange, almost paradoxical beauty of the plains, harsh, relentless, and yet endlessly instructive. Sleep arrives carrying the soft, constant hum of the prairie, the lingering awareness of human fragility, and a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that you have endured another day, physically intact, mentally amused, and cautiously optimistic about surviving the next. As the days stretch onward across the Great Plains, you begin to notice a subtle, almost hypnotic rhythm in your surroundings. Dust drifts endlessly in the golden sunlight, tiny motes that rise from the ground like invisible dancers, moving at the whim of the wind. The wind itself is patient, persistent, and utterly indifferent to human discomfort. It swirls through your hair, sweeps across your clothes, and carries with it the scent of prairie grass, sweat, and the faintly pungent aroma of oxen. At first you fight it, adjusting scarves, tightening hats, and muttering quietly about injustice. But gradually you recognize that resistance is futile. Acceptance, strangely, becomes comforting. Dust accumulates in all conceivable places. It forms thin layers on the canvas of your wagon, settles in the creases of your clothing, and sneaks into your boots with unrelenting precision. It finds its way into your food, your journal, and your sense of dignity. By the third day, you understand the paradoxical truth of the plains. Dust is both enemy and companion. It scratches and irritates, yet its constant presence becomes a kind of rhythm, marking the passage of time, the miles walked, and the endurance of human effort. Each breath, slightly gritty, reminds you of your own impermanence and the subtle humor of surviving under conditions designed to test patience to the extreme. The wind, often allied with the dust, has its own personality. At times it is playful, lifting tufts of grass in miniature waves, tugging at scarves and hems, and creating the illusion of movement in a landscape that is otherwise endlessly static. At other times it is aggressive, sweeping across the prairie, with enough force to nudge the wagon wheels off course or to rattle a tired oxen yoke. You have begun to anthropomorphize it subtly, referring to it occasionally as the prairie's persistent whisperer, or the subtle arbiter of humility. Depending on its mood, fellow travelers nod knowingly, as though acknowledging the truth in your observation. The wind is a constant, omnipresent test of patience and resolve. The oxen themselves add a rich texture to this meditation. You have begun to notice, in quiet, moments of reflection, the philosophical quality of their chewing. They move slowly, deliberately, chewing the same mouthfuls of prairie grass in endless repetition. Their eyes, large and patient, seem occasionally to follow your movements with a bemused intelligence, as if they are silently questioning the choices that brought humans to this dusty expanse. Occasionally one will pause mid-step, lift its head and gaze into the distance, prompting you to wonder whether it is contemplating the nature of existence, the futility of walking another mile, or simply the best way to avoid stepping on a particularly stubborn clump of grass. These subtle observations prompt a meditative state. You begin to synchronize your own steps with the oxen's chewing, the rise and fall of the prairie grasses, and the soft, insistent murmur of the wind. The landscape becomes less a series of obstacles and more a kind of living metronome. Time is measured in breaths of wind, crunches of gravel underfoot, and the occasional low hum of oxen lamenting perhaps their shared fate. In these moments you understand why so many pioneers described the plains as simultaneously hypnotic and maddening, beautiful, yet inescapably monotonous. The meditative quality of dust and wind is enhanced by the gentle sounds of the wagon train itself. Wheels creak with predictable rhythm, harnesses squeak and sway, and the occasional distant murmur of conversation threads through the steady background of the prairie. These sounds, layered with the subtle sigh of the wind and the chewing of oxen, create an auditory tapestry that is at once soothing and mildly unnerving. You note the paradox with wry amusement. Survival depends on attention to detail, yet losing oneself in the hypnotic quality of these details provides a necessary psychological balm. Sometimes the wind carries distant sounds that seem oddly musical. A rattling branch, a bird call, or the faint thump of hooves on hard-packed earth blends with the low, patient rhythm of the wagon wheels. You imagine the oxen's chewing as a sort of philosophical percussion, each bite marking the inexorable passage of time. You smile faintly at the thought, feeling simultaneously connected to the land and deeply aware of your own absurd smallness within it. The interplay of dust, wind, and oxen provokes reflection on human choices. Why, you wonder? Did pioneers decide that walking across thousands of miles of relentless prairie was preferable to staying in towns with indoor plumbing and predictable weather? You acknowledge quietly that the answer is lost to history, replaced by diaries, journals, and anecdotes that hint at hope, hubris, and curiosity. Dust scratches at your hands, wind tugs insistently at your scarf, and oxen chew with steadfast patience, and you begin to understand that the answers are less important than the rhythm, the endurance, and the subtle humor found in observation. In this meditative state, imagination becomes a form of survival. You begin to invent minor narratives about your oxen. Perhaps one is a philosopher pondering the meaning of chewing, another a disgruntled critic of human decision-making, and a third, an enthusiastic optimist who merely wishes for a cooler day and fewer miles. These mental exercises provide amusement, sustain morale, and allow you to engage with the landscape without succumbing to despair. Humor, once again, is revealed to be as essential as food, water, or proper footwear. As evening approaches, the wind softens and the dust settles slightly under the fading sun. The oxen pause to rest, chewing in gentle unison, their patience a silent instruction in endurance. You find a patch of dry grass to sit upon, allowing the subtle rhythm of the prairie to permeate your thoughts. The horizon glows with muted reds and golds, and for a moment the monotony feels like meditation rather than tedium. You reflect on the absurdity of human expectations, the patient wisdom of oxen, and the subtle lessons delivered by dust and wind alike. Night arrives quietly, with stars spread like scattered pins above the prairie. The wind whispers through the grass, rustling gently, and the oxen lie down, chewing slower now, perhaps contemplating the purpose of their daily labor. You lie in your bedroll, boots dusty, clothes stiff with dirt, and journal closed. The meditative lesson of the day is clear. The plains are relentless yet instructive, monotonous yet oddly comforting. By observing dust, wind, and the philosophical chewing of oxen, you cultivate patience, humor, and a perspective that will sustain you through endless miles of prairie. Sleep finally arrives, carrying the soft, persistent chorus of prairie life. Dust settles on your eyelashes, the wind murmurs through the grass, and the oxen chew in dreamlike rhythm. You, small, human, dusty, and slightly absurd, drift off to the gentle soundscape of the Great Plains, fully immersed in its eternal lessons and quiet humor. After days of dust, monotony, and oxen-fueled meditation, the landscape begins to change. The horizon, once an endless expanse of gently rolling plains, now hints at the jagged, uncompromising peaks of the Rockies. They loom like silent sentinels, indifferent to your plans, your optimism, and your ability to pack a wagon effectively. For a moment you might even feel awe, the sort of naive awe that disappears entirely the first time you attempt to move a heavy wagon up a slope that feels far steeper than gravity intended. Weather, as though conspiring with geography, also shifts dramatically. Mornings, previously marked by gentle sunlight and mild wind, are now accompanied by biting drafts that slice through every layer of clothing you own. Clouds gather with unannounced purpose, forming heavy grey masses that seem capable of spontaneously producing either rain, snow, or a sudden gust of wind strong enough to rearrange your carefully stacked supplies. Sunlight, when it appears, is brief, harsh, and insistent, reflecting off rocky surfaces in ways that almost convince you that it is actively mocking your journey. The terrain itself is transformed. Gentle prairie grass gives way to uneven, rocky ground, often coated in loose gravel mud, or a treacherous combination of both. Paths, previously marked by the tracks of other wagons, vanish into gullies, cliffs, or the sort of inclines that appear to have been designed solely to frustrate. human ingenuity. Every step is a negotiation with gravity, patience, and the increasingly vocal complaints of your oxen. Your optimism, once buoyed by the idea that each mile was merely another minor inconvenience to endure, now begins to falter. Wagons creak in ways you did not know wagons could creak. Wheels protest with grinding, ear-piercing moans. Canvas tents, previously stable in light prairie winds, now flap violently, threatening to collapse under even modest gusts. Each day, every hour, seems to emphasize your relative weakness and the unreasonableness of expecting harmony between human intention and natural design. Historical records of the Rockies crossing, which you have perused with a mixture of curiosity and grim fascination, become strangely relevant. Diaries recount the same themes. The mountains rise, and so does our resentment. Wagons shall never climb, yet we persist. Our optimism has been replaced by thinly veiled threats to the nearest ox. The accounts speak not of triumph, but of endurance, detailing hours spent heaving wheels over rocks, coaxing stubborn animals up impossible slopes, and managing morale that teetered perilously close to mutiny. You quickly discover the subtle cruelty of mountain weather. Clouds, heavy with moisture, obscure sightlines, leaving wagons and oxen vulnerable to sudden drops or slick terrain. Rain, when it arrives, is neither gentle nor predictable. It combines with mud, dust, and gravel to produce a substance both adhesive and treacherously slippery. Even a short incline becomes a test of collective ingenuity and brute force. Every misstep, a wheel caught in a rut, an ox losing footing, a crate of supplies toppling, is a reminder that mountains operate on rules that were never intended to accommodate optimism, good intentions, or human engineering. And yet, amidst this grinding challenge, there is beauty. Peaks rise sharply, dusted with snow in places, catching sunlight in ways that are almost impossible to capture on paper. Streams cascade down steep inclines with relentless energy, singing a song of persistence that you admire while simultaneously hoping it does not wash away your carefully stacked belongings. Wildlife appears more frequently, a lone goat on a cliff, an eagle circling far above, each creature perfectly adapted to the terrain in ways that make human attempts at navigation feel both comical and hopeless. The oxen, meanwhile, display a range of emotions, all of them directed at you. One may stubbornly plant its hooves in the mud, refusing to advance despite prod, plea, or quietly muttered threats. Another may lunge forward with surprising determination, only to slip a few feet later, eliciting a low, rumbling groan that you interpret as existential disappointment. You learn quickly that the mountains are not merely a physical challenge, they are a social one as well. Maintaining morale among your party, keeping oxen reasonably cooperative, and ensuring that the wagon does not collapse entirely requires negotiation, strategy, and occasionally dramatic displays of patience that are tested to their limits. Your fellow travelers, similarly, begin to display signs of stress. Minor complaints escalate into full-scale arguments over route choice, rest frequency, or even who is responsible for a particularly slippery wheel. The historical records you recall with wry amusement are filled with similar accounts. The party has taken to muttering under their breath. We now openly hate the mountains. Supplies are lost, tempers fray, and the oxen remain calm. We envy the oxen. These sentiments, while grim, are oddly comforting. You are not alone in your combination of exhaustion, frustration, and awe. Evenings in the mountains offer a peculiar sort of reprieve. As the sun dips behind jagged peaks, the temperature falls sharply. Campfires, carefully tended, provide both warmth and a focal point for conversation, though discussions are often brief, punctuated by long pauses to simply stare at the surrounding ridges. You notice a quiet camaraderie forming among the travelers, a mutual recognition that survival depends as much on cooperation and humor as on skill, strength, or any hope that the mountain might relent. You reflect on frostbite, poor choices, and minor disasters, inevitable companions of the Rockies. Diaries recount frostbitten toes, frozen water barrels, and ill-considered attempts to lighten wagons by jettisoning supplies, often the wrong supplies. You, mentally noting these historical lessons, attempt to plan carefully while recognizing, with dry humor, that at least half of human endeavor in these conditions consists of improvisation, error, and the quiet acceptance that mistakes are unavoidable. By nightfall, as the wind whistles between rocky outcrops and the distant peaks, loom in silhouette, you understand that optimism must be tempered by humility. The mountains do not negotiate. They do not care for hope, good intentions, or careful planning. They exist, imposing and eternal, and you must adapt, endure, and occasionally laugh at the absurdity of attempting to impose human logic on jagged stone, shifting mud, and recalcitrant oxen. Sleep is a fragile comfort. Bedrolls, damp with condensation or mud from misjudged placement, offer little protection from cold air that creeps insidiously through clothing and blankets. You lie awake for a while, listening to the wind whistle through nearby rocks, the distant creak of wagons settling, and the occasional groan of an ox expressing quiet disappointment in the human condition. Reflection, dry humor, and careful breathing become your final companions of the day. You fall asleep slowly, a faint smile on your face, recognizing the peculiar beauty of struggle. The Rockies loom, weather rages, wagons protest, and optimism fades, yet human endurance, subtle humor, and patient observation remain. You awaken to a day that feels entirely unremarkable until you attempt to move your wagon up the first real incline of the Rockies. At first glance, it is merely a slope, a slight, manageable rise. But within moments, you understand that manageable is a concept invented by those who have never attempted to drag a 200-pound wooden box with 2 oxen, a couple of mildly disgruntled humans, and a collection of supplies over terrain that seems to have been designed specifically to thwart human ambition. The art of pushing a wagon uphill is a subtle combination of brute force negotiation and quiet despair. You try leaning into it, hands on the frame, muscles straining, oxen groaning, sweat dripping, and it becomes immediately clear that physics has been unkind. Gravity, it seems, has taken a personal interest in your humiliation. Wheels skid in loose gravel, sinking into ruts that mock your efforts. Rocks, invisible until tripped over, conspire with uneven terrain to create minor disasters at every step. Historical diaries describe similar experiences, often with a mixture of grim accuracy and understated humor. One pioneer wrote, "We pushed, we cursed, and we cursed some more. The wagon did not ascend as expected. Neither did our patience." Another noted that wagons were designed for flat ground, civilized trails, and minor annoyances, not for mountains with serious opinions about human folly. You nod in quiet agreement, realizing that innovation in this context consists mainly of trial, error, and strategic grunting. You attempt various techniques. First, there is the push method. All humans and oxen are lined behind the wagon, leaning into it with a level of determination bordering on desperation. The wagon lurches slightly, then slides back as if testing your resolve. Sweat pours into your eyes, obscuring vision, and providing a gritty texture that blends seamlessly with the dust already embedded in every layer of clothing. You swear you hear a wheel groan in sarcastic delight. Next is the pull method. Ropes are tied, hands are grasped, oxen are urged forward with all the authority you can muster. The incline is steep enough that coordination becomes a minor miracle. One ox steps onto a loose rock, slips slightly, and you are reminded that half your energy is now spent stabilizing equipment rather than making forward progress. Fellow travelers mutter, curse quietly, or suggest alternative routes that may or may not exist. You try to remain diplomatic, though it is difficult to maintain tact while simultaneously imagining the wagon rolling back over your toes. Short breaks are taken, though rarely enough to feel restorative. Dust and sweat coat everything anew, blending into a grimy layer that seems almost ceremonial. Conversation shifts to practical matters. Which ox is most likely to cooperate? Which wheel is least likely to collapse under stress? And whose decision it was to store water barrels near the edge of a rocky incline? Humor, however faint, persists, often in the form of dry commentary. At least gravity is consistent, you note, eliciting a brief, grim chuckle from someone who has learned the value of sarcasm as a survival tool. The wagons themselves display remarkable obstinacy. Wheels dig into loose soil, occasionally jumping free with alarming abruptness, while the axles creak as if laughing quietly at your hubris. Canvas sides flap in the wind, sounding like distant sighs of disapproval. Supplies jostle violently inside, creating a percussion of rations, pots, and personal belongings that emphasizes the fragile and chaotic nature of human organization. Half your party begins to resent you, not for personal failings, but for the audacity of having chosen a route that requires pushing wagons up terrain that was never meant for wheeled conveyances. Historical accounts confirm this is standard procedure. By the Rockies, half the group despises the expedition leader. One diarist notes, and the other half is too exhausted to care. You nod, silently agreeing, while carefully balancing the competing priorities of survival, diplomacy, and maintaining enough dignity to avoid being rolled under the wagon yourself. Occasionally, disaster strikes with dramatic subtlety. A wheel slips sideways. A crate of provisions topples, or an ox loses balance and leans into you, with a force that reminds you of your minor mortality. You react with the practiced calm of someone who has been humiliated by terrain before, grunting, adjusting, and resuming the push with quiet, grim determination. Your body aches in new, unfamiliar ways. Muscles you did not know existed now protest vehemently. Your hands blister, your back groans, and your boots fill with rocks that were mysteriously absent only moments before. Amidst the physical struggle, there is a strange psychological rhythm. The incline, impossible though it seems, becomes a meditation, an endurance. You observe patterns, the way oxen shift weight, the subtle give of the wagon frame, the behavior of gravel under pressure. You note that progress is incremental, often imperceptible, but measurable in fractions of inches, millimeters, and the occasional faint groan from a particularly overworked wheel. This slow, deliberate observation is essential, a lesson in patience, improvisation, and quiet, humorous acceptance of human limitation. Evening approaches with a mixture of relief and anxiety. The incline, though partially conquered, has left all participants, human and oxen alike, exhausted, dusty, and contemplative. Supplies are rearranged, oxen are given respite, and the wagon is inspected for damage, which is inevitably present. Conversations revolve around survival strategy, shared misery, and humorous exaggerations of minor incidents. A crate that rolled down an incline, an ox that refused to budge, or a rock that seems inexplicably personal in its intent to impede progress. As night settles, the mountains loom silently around camp, jagged and indifferent. The air is cooler, sharper, and carries the scent of distant snow, rock, and wind-swept dust. You lie in your bedroll, muscles aching, boots filled with detritus, and contemplate the day's lessons. Endurance is as much mental as physical. Patience is essential. Humor is a survival tool, and human ambition, while admirable, is often met with natural indifference. Sleep arrives slowly, accompanied by the creaking of wagons settling, the faint sigh of oxen chewing contemplatively, and the whisper of wind through rocky outcrops. You are exhausted, humbled, and slightly exhilarated, a participant in the grand, absurd, and rigorous art of pushing wagons up something they were never designed to climb. By the time you reach the foothills of the Rockies, you have already begun to notice subtle changes in your party. Conversations are shorter, patience thinner, and complaints louder. Dust and fatigue, previously considered minor irritants, have been upgraded to existential grievances. You can see the quiet resentment forming in glances, in muttered underbreath, commentary, and in the occasional pointed sigh when you suggest yet another strategic pause or attempt at navigation. Historically, the Rockies crossing was notorious among pioneers. Travelers documented with wry despair the sheer improbability of navigating wagons through steep, uneven terrain while contending with unpredictable weather and limited supplies. The mountains do not negotiate, one diary notes, and neither does human morale once the first incline has been attempted. Historians suggest that anywhere from a third to a half of any wagon train grew openly hostile toward expedition leaders by the time the Rockies were approached. You glance at your companions, dust-coated, eyes narrowed, and find yourself empathizing deeply with this statistic. The resentment is not without justification. Half your party has been forced to lift, shove, and coax wagons along inclines that defy reasonable expectation. Rations have shifted in priority. Dried meat and hardtack are consumed at alarming rates, water supplies rationed more carefully than a miser guarding gold. Blisters, sore muscles, and bruises form a silent chorus of complaint, while every minor mishap is magnified into a dramatic event, a wheel sticking, an ox misstepping, or a crate of flour tumbling down a slope. You have become, perhaps unwillingly, a central figure in this slow-building drama of survival and exasperation. Historical accounts reveal that leadership in such conditions was rarely about charisma or wisdom alone. Success often depended on endurance, negotiation, and the occasional display of strategic stubbornness. Leaders who attempted diplomacy too frequently were perceived as indecisive. Those who pressed the group forward without acknowledgement of hardship were despised as tyrants. You reading these accounts recognize that you occupy both roles simultaneously. A benevolent oppressor whose good intentions are eternally misunderstood, and an indecisive planner whose best strategies involve brute force and prayer. The Rockies themselves are indifferent to human conflict. Cliffs rise, scree slides unpredictably, and weather shifts with a fickle temperament that seems designed to test both physical and psychological limits. Snow, rain, and sleet appear with little warning, turning already treacherous paths into near-impassable obstacles. One historical observer wrote that a wagon attempting to ascend without careful placement, timing, and sheer stubbornness is little more than a rolling monument to futility. You glance at your wagon, wheels half buried in gravel, and nod, with the solemn understanding of someone who has tested this theory firsthand. Resentment toward leadership, though historically documented, is also fueled by small cumulative indignities. Meals are delayed, blankets and supplies jostled, minor injuries neglected, and everyone's personal space, such as it exists in a wagon train, is compromised. Conversation devolves into subtle barbs, sarcastic remarks, and occasional open muttering about past life choices, family decisions, and the advisability of ever attempting westward migration. You note that half your group now hates you, not because of a single misdeed, but because each minor hardship has been logged, accumulated, and reinforced by shared misery. Yet there is humor in historical context. Diaries, letters, and journals reveal that pioneers were aware of their absurd predicament. One writer dryly notes, "We push wooden boxes over mountains, consume hardtack until our tongues revolt, and yet we continue, imagining this to be progress." Another adds, "Leadership is a cruel joke. No matter what is done, half the group complains, and the oxen seem to judge us silently." You recognize quietly that humor has always been a coping mechanism, a subtle balm against the relentless challenges of nature and human foibles. The mountains are teaching lessons in endurance and perspective. Each incline conquered is a minor victory. Each slip, tumble, or toppled crate is a reminder that human control is limited, and resilience is the currency of survival. You notice the intricate negotiation required between humans and animals alike, coaxing oxen to move over slippery terrain, distributing weight in wagons, and determining the safest paths across scree-strewn slopes. Historical records emphasize that misjudgment in any of these tasks could result in injury, loss of supplies, or further deterioration of morale. By mid-afternoon, the psychological weight of the mountains is almost tangible. Dust mixes with sweat, hands blister, and the steady groan of wagons under strain becomes a soundtrack for endurance. Observing your party, you notice the subtle signs of simmering discontent, narrowed eyes, muttered comments, and an occasional dramatic pause before a particularly difficult maneuver. Humor, sarcasm, and quiet encouragement are now as critical as brute force in moving wagons forward. Historical context offers additional perspective on the dangers of mountain crossings. Accidents were common. Wagons tipped on steep inclines, oxen slipped into ravines, and travelers suffered frostbite, sprains, and exhaustion-induced delirium. One record states, "The mountains were not merely a physical obstacle, but a psychological one. Despair arrived long before snow or rock did." You recognize this truth as you negotiate your own wagon over a particularly tricky incline, offering quiet encouragement to oxen and humans alike, while attempting to maintain your dignity. By evening, you arrive at a temporary plateau. The incline is behind you, though more remains ahead. The air is colder, sharper, and scented faintly of rock, pine, and lingering snow. The party is exhausted, mood subdued, and everyone's respect for leadership teeters precariously. Historical. Accounts reassure you that this is normal. Tension peaks at the Rockies, tempers fray, and the combination of physical strain, weather, and difficult terrain produces a slow but predictable erosion of collective patience. You note with dry amusement that history has accurately predicted the current state of affairs. Half your party openly resents you, the other half quietly plots minor acts of sabotage against future decisions. Night brings a tentative truce. Camp is set, wagons secured, and oxen rested. Conversation, though sparse, turns to minor humor, complaints about today's incline, exaggerated descriptions of the mountain's cruelty, and observations on fellow travelers increasingly dramatic. You reflect on the historical continuity of this experience, recognizing that pioneers across generations endured remarkably similar struggles, demonstrating that human behavior in extreme conditions is predictable, if entertaining in its subtle absurdity. As you lie in your bedroll, boots crusted with mud, hands stiff from exertion and muscles aching from effort, you contemplate the Rockies. The peaks, indifferent and imposing, teach lessons in endurance, humility, and perspective. You acknowledge silently that resentment from half your party is both justified and historically standard. Humor, observation, and careful reflection are essential survival tools. Sleep comes slowly, accompanied by the low groan of settling wagons, the occasional sigh of a disgruntled ox, and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow will demand similar patience, strength, and perseverance. You close your eyes, aware that the mountains loom. The party simmers, and history has already prepared you for the subtle, relentless comedy of surviving the Rockies. And with that recognition, sleep arrives, dusty, exhausted, and faintly triumphant. Night in the Rockies has a peculiar way of revealing the limits of human comfort. The air is thin, cold, and sharp, a tactile reminder that altitude, temperature, and exhaustion are ingredients for subtle but relentless punishment. By the time you settle into your bedroll, you notice that your fingers are stiff, toes mildly numb, and the previously mild ache in your legs has evolved into a persistent, insistent reminder that gravity and poor decision-making have not been entirely kind. Historical accounts repeatedly caution about frostbite, and reading them now feels like a combination of morbid curiosity and quiet, begrudging amusement. Diaries describe toes turning blue, ears stiffening to a degree that makes communication difficult, and fingers becoming rigid enough to render even the simplest tasks, holding a cup of coffee, adjusting a wagon rope, or scribbling in a journal, an exercise in ingenuity. You look down at your own extremities, now tinged pink, then white, and imagine the countless pioneers who navigated the Rockies while wondering if they would ever feel their toes again. The subtle humor in historical accounts is, as always, dry and understated. One traveler notes, "We lost feeling in our feet, yet we maintained our dignity, or at least what was left of it." Another records, "Poor choices compounded by frostbite teach valuable lessons, though the cost is rarely measured in currency." You reflect on your own decisions, the decision to leave camp later than advisable, the choice to wear leather boots that were charmingly insufficient against wet snow, the insistence on pushing a wagon while ignoring both weather forecasts and common sense. Each error, minor in isolation, contributes to the cumulative absurdity of your situation. Frostbite, you realize, is both a physical and philosophical teacher. It demonstrates the consequences of inadequate preparation, the inexorable laws of nature, and the subtle cruelty of delayed consequences. You wiggle your toes cautiously, aware that each movement is a negotiation with sensation, circulation, and patience. Your fingers, stiff from hours of rope pulling, hold the journal awkwardly as you scribble a note to self. Do not underestimate the mountains or your own overconfidence. The poor choices you reflect upon are manifold. The decision to pack, certain supplies in favor of others, the insistence on a particular route, and the occasional underestimation of both incline and weather all feel magnified in the harsh light of a Rocky Mountain night. The historical record is generous in its warnings. Mistakes are unavoidable, humility is mandatory, and laughter is perhaps the only sustainable coping mechanism. You smile faintly at this recognition, realizing that the absurdity of human ambition is matched only by the mountain's indifference. Your fellow travelers, meanwhile, display a mixture of resilience and quiet muttering. Some have taken to double-wrapping socks, others to rubbing hands vigorously until they ache, and still others to a kind of quiet, resigned stoicism that involves staring into the night and pretending that cold, exhaustion, and frostbite are minor inconveniences rather than potentially significant threats. You observe this behavior with wry amusement, recognizing a timeless pattern. Human endurance thrives on ritual, observation, and subtle humor. The interplay of frostbite and poor choices becomes a meditation. Each decision, whether trivial or consequential, is a negotiation with nature's indifference. You contemplate minor triumphs, keeping your fingers warm by tucking them under layers of cloth, successfully moving the wagon up a particularly treacherous incline, and ensuring the oxen remain steady, alongside minor defeats like a toppled water barrel or a blistered hand. Reflection becomes part of survival, allowing you to learn quietly without fanfare from both human error and natural challenge. Historical anecdotes offer both warning and amusement. One journal recounts the story of a traveler who, after a misjudged campfire placement, ended the night with frostbite in one hand and the other used for gesturing emphatic complaints. Another describes the choice to ascend a slope too quickly, resulting in frozen toes, a toppled wagon, and a lingering grudge against both terrain and leadership. The pattern is clear. Poor choices compounded by natural obstacles are universal, inevitable, and worthy of quiet, dry humor. Evening settles into a rhythm of observation, reflection, and subtle meditation. The mountains loom, silent and imposing, while the wind whispers between peaks, carrying the faint chill of snow and distant rock slides. Oxen huddle in nearby stalls, chewing methodically, as if offering quiet moral support and philosophical commentary on human folly. You, dusty, cold, and somewhat stiff, recognize that the accumulation of errors, poor judgment, and frostbite is a shared experience, one that binds the party, tests endurance, and reveals the quiet absurdity of survival. Sleep, when it arrives, is a mixture of relief and vigilance. Bedrolls, damp with condensation or dust, offer fragile warmth. Blankets, layered and tucked, are only partially effective. You drift off with fingers and toes tinged pink, aware that frostbite is both teacher and reminder. Dreams are faintly humorous. Wagons clambering impossibly over jagged peaks, oxen offering unsolicited advice, and historical diarists nodding in quiet approval at your persistence despite repeated poor decisions. By morning, you awaken with stiff muscles, slightly improved circulation, and a renewed sense of humility. Frostbite has abated for the moment, though its memory lingers in every cautious step, subtle gesture, and careful handling of ropes and wagon boards. You reflect on the quiet humor of history. Pioneers endured, persisted, and survived, often through a combination of error, improvisation, and dry wit. As the sun rises, casting long shadows across jagged peaks, you gather supplies, check the oxen, and prepare for another day. The mountains loom, cold and indifferent. Frostbite and poor choices remain constant companions. And yet, armed with historical insight, dry humor, and quiet reflection, you feel, paradoxically, prepared to continue. Sleep fades into wakefulness with a gentle acknowledgement. The Rockies are formidable, frostbite is real, and you're human. Flaws are unavoidable. Acceptance, patience, and subtle amusement will carry you forward, one icy step at a time. By mid-morning, as the Rockies loom behind and the wagon wheels groan with a mixture of fatigue and existential disappointment, a spark of inspiration strikes you. It is the kind of inspiration that, in retrospect, should have been immediately ignored. The brilliant idea that, rather than following the well-trodden, painstakingly slow route through valleys and passes already documented by cautious pioneers, You might instead take a shortcut. A slightly faster, definitely more exciting path, as you charmingly describe it, with an optimism that now seems almost naive. Your companions, dust-coated and weary from days of climbing impossible inclines, respond predictably. A mixture of skepticism, quiet resignation, and thinly veiled hostility fills the air. You notice subtle signs, narrowed eyes, lips pressed into thin lines, and the occasional pointed sigh that seems to say, "This will be regrettable." Yet, inspired by your own blend of ambition and poor judgment, you press on with gentle persuasion. We'll save hours, possibly days. Think of the historical significance, the adventure. Historical accounts of similar misjudgments abound. In the 1840s, numerous wagon trains set off on shortcuts that promised accelerated progress and glorious efficiency. Diaries reveal the predictable pattern. A bold decision is made, enthusiasm is temporarily renewed, initial gains seem promising. Then terrain, weather, or bad maps intervene, and the shortcut reveals itself as a slow, circuitous, and often dangerous detour. You glance at your companions, already resigned to this archetypal experience, and suppress a quiet chuckle at your own human consistency. The terrain along this shortcut is immediately suspect. Gentle slopes quickly give way to irregular, gullies, loose rock, and mud that shifts beneath the wagon wheels. Grass, deceptively inviting, hides shallow ravines and tiny, treacherous streams. You quickly realize that the shortcut is not so much a time saver as a gentle lesson in humility, a slow, deliberate course correction guided by gravity, poor judgment, and the occasional muttered curse from oxen. Despite the growing evidence that the route may be a poor choice, optimism persists, if only in small, stubborn bursts. You note that humans are inherently inclined to value perceived efficiency over prudence. A shortcut will save time, you argue, even as wheels scrape against jagged rocks and a crate of flour teeters dangerously on the edge of a slope. Historical diaries echo this sentiment. Pioneers consistently overestimated the benefits of alternate routes, underestimating the obstacles and overestimating their own ingenuity. You nod to yourself, acknowledging a timeless human flaw, the eternal desire to save time by creating new, entirely avoidable problems. Your oxen, meanwhile, communicate subtle but unmistakable opinions on the matter. One leans stubbornly against the yoke, refusing to advance. Another pauses mid-step to chew contemplatively, eyes following your path as if silently questioning your judgment. You interpret these gestures with a combination of amusement and mild alarm. Clearly, the animals understand the precariousness of this decision far better than you do. Historical anecdotes confirm that shortcuts were rarely the efficient, scenic, or enjoyable paths they were imagined to be. One wagon train attempting a supposedly faster route became lost for 3 days, food and water supplies dwindling alarmingly, morale collapsing, and tempers fraying. Another detour involved crossing unstable streams where wagons toppled and livestock was lost. The consistent lesson: shortcuts often result in greater expenditure of effort, delayed progress, and minor to severe disasters. You glance at your own wagon, precariously positioned on a loose incline, and silently acknowledge that you are participating in a well-documented, centuries-old tradition of human overconfidence. As the day progresses, logistical challenges multiply. The terrain is irregular, forcing frequent stops to realign wagons, adjust supplies, and reassure oxen. Loose rocks shift unpredictably, creating micro-obstacles that consume both time and patience. Every incline conquered is followed by another, often steeper and less predictable, requiring both brute force and careful calculation. Your companion's whispered commentary becomes a soundtrack. Thinly veiled threats, sarcastic praise for your excellent judgment, and quiet mutterings of historical precedent that suggest an intimate familiarity with human folly. Evening offers a brief respite, though the shortcut has already exacted its toll. Supplies are rearranged, wheels inspected for damage, and oxen allowed a moment of rest. Conversations are muted, humor sparse but present, often in the form of dry, understated commentary. I see the shortcut has expanded our journey by approximately a day and a half, someone notes, eliciting a faint collective groan. You smile faintly, appreciating the historical continuity of human ambition and its occasional catastrophic consequences. Nightfall brings reflection. You lie in your bedroll, boots dusty, hands scraped from minor handling errors, and contemplate the subtle genius of historical precedent. Every pioneer who attempted a shortcut offers a cautionary tale. Ambition is commendable, patience essential, and humor, particularly dry, understated humor, indispensable. You recognize that the shortcut, though initially seductive, has become a meditation in endurance, humility, and gentle acceptance of error. As sleep approaches, the wagon rests on uneven ground, the oxen chew quietly, and the party drifts into a combination of exhaustion and reluctant amusement. You reflect on the human tendency to overestimate efficiency, underestimate difficulty, and ignore advice in favor of adventure. Historical records provide reassurance. You are not alone in this error, merely a participant in a centuries-old narrative of human overconfidence, dry humor, and incremental learning. Sleep arrives slowly, accompanied by the groan of the wagon, settling into gravel, the sigh of oxen considering your decision, and the quiet murmur of companions acknowledging with gentle resignation the inevitable consequences of the shortcut. You drift off, Dusty, exhausted and faintly triumphant, comforted by the knowledge that history repeats itself, humor persists, and the mountains, weather, and poor decisions will continue to shape your journey in equal measure. If history has taught you anything, it is this. Humans are profoundly committed to the illusion of efficiency. From the moment you suggested a shortcut, every action taken has been motivated by a quiet, almost reverent belief that time can be saved, that effort can be minimized, and that nature will somehow bend politely to human ambition. And yet the mountains, the wagons, and the oxen maintain a delightful indifference, demonstrating, with exquisite precision, the folly of such optimism. Consider for a moment the paradoxical nature of the shortcut. The promise of saving hours, perhaps even days, by deviating from the well-established trail is seductive. Maps, often inaccurate, occasionally imaginative, and always prone to human error, are consulted with solemn determination. Compass readings are repeated, terrain is scanned, and every decision is annotated with optimism, cautious reassurance, and the quiet hope that this time, perhaps, the shortcut might actually work. In practice, of course, the shortcut rarely delivers on its promises. A gentle incline suddenly becomes a cliff, a stream appears out of nowhere, and a previously firm patch of soil transforms into a treacherous quagmire. Every minor delay, misstep, or toppled crate reinforces the lesson that shortcuts are best appreciated in hindsight, a historical amusement rather than a practical solution. Diaries from the 1840s recount similar experiences. We endeavored to save time. We failed. Our oxen remained indifferent. The phrase resonates now, as wheels jam in loose gravel and oxen regard you with an expression that could easily be described as resigned contempt. Humor, dry and understated, emerges naturally in this environment. There is comedy in the predictable, chaos that follows each human attempt to impose efficiency on an uncaring landscape. The wagon tilts slightly to one side, a crate of flour tumbles down an incline, and a companion mutters sotto voce, "Brilliant shortcut indeed." You nod in quiet acknowledgement. Humor is the lens through which endurance is filtered, transforming minor disasters into shared amusement and subtle historical continuity. Historical anecdotes abound with examples of the same phenomenon. One journal recounts a shortcut that consumed 3 additional days due to a combination of poor planning, loose soil, and the stubborn refusal of oxen to cooperate. Another describes a route that promised a scenic view, but delivered hours of climbing, sliding, and ultimately cursing. Each account is peppered with dry commentary on human ambition, patience, and the peculiar satisfaction derived from being proven wrong by terrain. You recognize a kindred spirit in these diarists. Humor, after all, is universal when faced with predictable folly. The mechanics of wasted time are subtle yet profound. Each stop to adjust wagons consumes minutes that feel like hours. Misjudged. Inclines require repeated attempts, each accompanied by physical exertion and quiet muttering. Routes that appeared deceptively easy on a map are revealed, through slow, painful experience, to be slightly less forgiving than gravity, mud, and poor judgment would allow. Every moment spent correcting minor errors is, in effect, time intentionally wasted, under the guise of saving it. Your companions, increasingly practiced in subtle sarcasm, develop a quiet lexicon for these incidents. Phrases such as the brilliance of forward planning, ingenious efficiency, and timely disaster are employed with a mixture of irony and survival instinct. You, dusty and exhausted, contribute modestly to this dialogue, recognizing that shared humor mitigates tension, maintains morale, and provides a gentle, soothing counterpoint to the relentless challenges of the mountains. Even oxen participate, in their own subtle way. One may refuse to advance along a particularly difficult incline, another may stumble deliberately, and a third may emit low, rumbling groans that, interpreted generously, suggest quiet amusement or passive disapproval. The subtle interplay between human desire for efficiency and animal indifference becomes an unspoken lesson in humility, patience, and the inherent comedy of attempting to master nature with nothing more than wooden wheels, rope, and good intentions. By mid-afternoon, the pattern is clear. Every human attempt to save time is counterbalanced by natural obstacles, minor miscalculations, and the gentle, persistent resistance of the mountains themselves. Historical records reinforce this observation. Attempts to impose order on the terrain often result in delays, minor disasters, and slightly bruised egos. Diaries, with their dry humor, suggest that patience and acceptance are the true markers of efficiency, far more than speed or ambition. You nod, mentally filing the observation under applicable wisdom for future generations, or at least future miles. The philosophical dimension of wasted time emerges subtly as well. Each delay, misstep, and toppled crate is a meditation on human hubris. The mountains, indifferent to human goals, provide both obstacle and instructor, demonstrating that efficiency is often a matter of perception rather than reality. Humor, endurance, and observation are essential. Brute force alone is insufficient. You reflect quietly on this as you coax your wagon over a loose incline, acknowledging that historical precedent has once again proven useful. Evening arrives with gentle inevitability. Supplies are reorganized, oxen attended, and wagons are inspected for minor damage. All activities undertaken with the quiet awareness that the shortcut has predictably consumed more time than the original route would have. Conversation turns to humorous exaggeration, the brilliance of your judgment, the mountain's impeccable timing, and the human tendency to complicate simplicity with creativity, ambition, and occasional overconfidence. You smile faintly, recognizing that humor, like patience, is a critical survival tool. As night settles over the Rockies, dust, sweat, and mild frostbite combine to create a quiet, meditative state. The mountains loom silently, indifferent, while oxen chew methodically, and companions reflect on the day's events with subtle, understated amusement. You lie in your bedroll, tired but reflective, appreciating the paradoxical wisdom inherent in wasted time. Efforts to save it often produce the richest material for humor, endurance, and subtle philosophical reflection. Sleep arrives slowly, accompanied by the groan of wagons settling, the soft exhalation of oxen, and the quiet acknowledgement that humans, in their eternal desire to save time, will invariably waste it. And yet, in this gentle, predictable chaos there is comfort. Shared experience, historical continuity, and dry, understated humor provide a soothing counterpoint to the relentless, uncooperative mountains. By mid-morning, after several hours of following what was confidently advertised as a brilliant shortcut, you begin to notice subtle signs that perhaps optimism was slightly misplaced. Wagons are stuck in soft soil, oxen are chewing contemplatively, and your companion's muttered commentary has evolved from mild sarcasm to something resembling despair. Dust coats everything, the sun beats down unevenly, and the map you so confidently consulted now seems to be questioning your life choices. Historical records of lost wagon trains, which you had read with the detached amusement of someone not, yet personally invested, suddenly feel remarkably prescient. Diaries from 1845 describe entire parties wandering for days along ill-advised routes, rations dwindling, morale collapsing, and a variety of minor disasters compounding into something resembling chaos. One entry reads, "We were certain of our direction. The land had other plans." You nod knowingly, staring at your own compass, wondering if it too has joined the rebellion against human certainty. Bad maps are a surprisingly serious problem. Surveyors in the mid-19th century, often operating with incomplete data and questionable measurement tools, produced documents that were at once earnest and misleading. Trails marked as manageable could in reality be impassable. Elevation changes, hidden ravines, and treacherous river crossings were omitted or understated, often with the faint implication that readers would be thrilled to discover them in person. Following such maps becomes a subtle game of endurance, patience and occasional cursing, with humor serving as the most effective navigation tool. As your shortcut continues to unravel, you begin to notice minor signs of panic among your companions. One person, previously calm, quietly questions whether the mountains themselves have shifted overnight. Another consults the map with growing suspicion, fingers tracing lines that clearly represent roads, rivers, or terrain features that you begin to suspect were drawn with artistic license. Conversation becomes a mix of historical anecdote and quiet speculation. "Remember the Smith party of 42? They vanished for 3 days here," someone whispers. "And they had oxen. Worse than ours." You nod, appreciating both the historical precedent and the subtle reassurance that human error is universal. Your own reflection is calm, though tinged with mild embarrassment. You, who suggested the shortcut with quiet confidence, now navigate uneven terrain, coax reluctant oxen, and rearrange supplies that have shifted catastrophically in the back of the wagon. Every misstep, toppled crate, or minor injury reinforces the lesson learned repeatedly in pioneer diaries. Shortcuts are seductive, maps are often misleading, and humans are rarely as competent as they believe. The historical record is rich with cautionary tales. One party attempted a route promising a 2-day reduction in travel time. They spent 6 days wandering in circles, consumed a week's worth of rations, and eventually emerged with fewer oxen and more bruised egos than they began with. Another, following a detailed map, encountered cliffs, fast-moving streams, and an unexpectedly high probability of minor frostbite. Each anecdote reinforces the theme: bad maps are not merely inconvenient. They are catalysts for human endurance, dry humor, and collective frustration. You pause for a moment atop a particularly treacherous incline and survey the surrounding landscape. Rolling hills appear deceptively calm, while the actual path ahead is a jumble of loose gravel, hidden gullies, and subtle elevation changes that could easily unsettle wagons and morale alike. Dust swirls in the breeze, oxen sigh in mild protest, and companions exchange quiet, pointed glances. The map, folded neatly in your hand, suddenly feels less like a tool and more like a historical artifact of human optimism and occasional hubris. Time slows, as it often does when humans wander with purpose, but without certainty. Each mile takes hours, each incline demands careful negotiation, and each misstep reminds everyone of their collective vulnerability. Humor persists, often understated and wry. A toppled crate, a misjudged slope, or a particularly stubborn ox becomes a story repeated quietly over evening campfires. These moments, though minor in isolation, coalesce into a subtle narrative of endurance, patience, and quiet amusement at the predictable consequences of following a shortcut. Evening arrives with a mixture of relief and lingering tension. Wagons are inspected, oxen watered, and supplies reorganized. Conversation focuses on historical precedent: which wagon trains truly got lost, how long they wandered, and which poor. Maps guided their misery. You, tired but reflective, note the comfort of historical perspective. Even when human judgment fails, the continuity of error provides a soothing, almost meditative reassurance. Humor, endurance, and subtle observation are now more critical than efficiency or speed. Night brings calm, though the wagon is precariously balanced on uneven ground. Oxen chew quietly, the mountains loom silently, and the companions drift into sleep with varying degrees of skepticism about your navigational competence. Historical anecdotes echo softly in your mind. Entire parties have survived similar misadventures, relying on humor, resilience, and an acceptance of human fallibility. You drift off with a gentle smile, recognizing that the dangers of following bad maps are mitigated by patience, observation, and a steady appreciation for the absurdity of the human condition. Sleep is accompanied by gentle creaking of wagons settling, low, thoughtful sighs from oxen, and the quiet, reassuring knowledge that your shortcut, though misguided, is part of a long tradition of human error, dry wit, and incremental learning. You dream faintly of maps drawn with optimism, wagons teetering precariously, and diarists from the past quietly nodding in approval at your participation in a timeless ritual, the art of being lost in the pursuit of efficiency. As the day wears on, the shortcut begins to reveal its true character. Less a time-saving marvel, and more a masterclass in logistical chaos. The terrain becomes increasingly capricious. Gentle inclines are replaced with jagged drops, shallow, streams deepen unexpectedly, and loose soil shifts under the wheels as though nature itself is conducting a quiet, persistent experiment in human endurance. Every step forward requires coordination, calculation, and a fair measure of patience, and none of these are things in abundant supply. Supplies, previously organized with admirable precision, now betray their usefulness. Crates tumble, sacks split, and utensils are scattered in the dust. The careful inventory you had taken that morning is rendered meaningless by repeated misadventures, flour now partially baked into a gritty powder on the wagon floor, dried meat slipping under crates, and the occasional personal belonging, a hat, a journal, or an especially sentimental sock, lost to the whims of gravity. Your companions, though silent, demonstrate subtle disapproval in the form of narrowed eyes and increasingly pointed sighs. The oxen, wise in their way, contribute to the chaos with quiet obstinacy. One refuses to advance, another steps gingerly, on loose rocks, and a third seems to engage in philosophical contemplation, pausing mid-step to chew thoughtfully, while occasionally glancing at you with what you interpret as mild judgment. Historical accounts suggest that such behavior is entirely normal. The oxen, after all, are intimately familiar with the difficulty of shortcut navigation and possess an almost Zen-like ability to demonstrate patience in the face of human folly. Human tempers, unsurprisingly, fray with subtle efficiency. Complaints are whispered under breath, sarcasm is delivered with precision, and occasional outbursts punctuate the rhythm of travel. You notice the progression. Initially, minor grievances, then quiet muttering, and finally, carefully phrased statements intended to remind everyone, including you, that shortcuts like optimism are best tempered with caution. Yet humor persists, serving as a gentle, soothing counterpoint to rising tension. A toppled crate becomes a narrative of adventure. A misstep in mud is recast as a minor moral lesson, and the increasingly precarious positioning of wagons is viewed as an elaborate, if accidental, choreography. The mountains themselves contribute to the spectacle. Loose rocks, treacherous inclines, and sudden drops create a dynamic environment that responds unpredictably to human ambition. Wagons tilt dangerously, wheels slip, and ropes fray, all while the landscape remains indifferent, silent, and quietly majestic. The combination of natural obstacles and human error creates a symphony of chaos that is paradoxically both alarming and oddly soothing. Historical diarists describe similar experiences. The mountains are unforgiving yet predictable in their indifference, and the ability to observe and adapt is the hallmark of survival. Navigation requires constant recalibration. Every misjudged slope necessitates a pause, a readjustment of the wagon, and a careful consultation of maps that are, at this point, suspected of being more decorative than informative. Companions coordinate movements with a mixture of precision and exasperation. Oxen are coaxed with patience and gentle commands, and minor injuries, scraped hands, bruised legs, blistered feet, are attended to with careful improvisation. The chaos, though exhausting, has a rhythm, an ebb and flow of human effort, animal response, and environmental feedback that gradually becomes familiar, even comforting. Humor remains essential. The absurdity of attempting a shortcut, the minor disasters, and the subtle interplay of human ambition and nature's indifference are appreciated with dry wit. Observations are made. The mountains have a sense of irony, one companion mutters, and apparently a good sense of timing. Laughter is quiet but present, a vital tonic that preserves morale and keeps the mind focused on endurance rather than despair. Historical context reassures you. Pioneers have always relied on humor to navigate chaos, and the pattern repeats here, timeless and comforting. Evening approaches with a mixture of relief and continued tension. Wagons are inspected, oxen tended, and supplies reorganized with careful attention. The shortcut, though demonstrably inefficient, has provided valuable lessons in coordination, patience, and the subtle art of improvisation. Each minor disaster, a toppled crate, a mud-stuck wheel, a lost hat, is catalogued, discussed, and reframed as a gentle anecdote in the ongoing story of survival. Night brings a quiet, almost meditative descent. The wagons are settled, oxen huddle in a combination of rest and contemplative observation, and companions reflect on the day with understated humor. You lie in your bedroll, tired but reflective, appreciating the paradoxical serenity of chaos. Though the shortcut has produced logistical mayhem, it has also fostered teamwork, creativity, and dry, understated amusement. The mountains loom, silent and indifferent, while human perseverance continues to negotiate the delicate balance between ambition and consequence. Sleep arrives slowly, accompanied by the creak of wagons settling, the faint sighs of oxen, and the quiet acknowledgement of companions that human error, poor maps, and shortcuts are integral components of the journey. Dreams are filled with tilted wagons, scattered supplies, and the occasional sarcastic diary entry from pioneers of yore, nodding approvingly at your participation in a timeless pattern of logistical chaos. Morning promises another day of careful negotiation, subtle humor, and measured patience. You awaken dusty and weary, yet strangely comforted by the predictable rhythm of disaster, a pattern that has existed for generations, documented in historical accounts, and now experienced firsthand. The mountains, oxen, companions, and wagons are all participants in this slow, soothing, and absurdly beautiful descent into chaos. And with that recognition, you rise, ready to continue, knowing that human ingenuity, humor, and endurance will carry you forward, one careful, chaotic step at a time. By the time the mountains fade behind you, you are acutely aware of a strange paradoxical feeling. Hope mingled with doubt, fatigue tempered by cautious anticipation. The land ahead stretches endlessly, but the promise of civilization, or something approximating it, seems tantalizingly close, or not. The ambiguity is exhausting in a subtle way. You've learned that in the Oregon Trail, nearly there is a concept entirely subject to interpretation, temporal distortion, and the whims of oxen. Your companions display a remarkable if fragile mixture of optimism and suspicion. Conversations occasionally turn to distance remaining, though the discussion is always accompanied by a quiet disclaimer. We're probably still 20 miles out, or 40, or perhaps lost again. Diaries from the mid-1840s suggest that this uncertainty was a hallmark of the final stretches. The mind clings to hope, the body is spent, and yet reality remains stubbornly indifferent. You nod, recognizing that the human tendency to exaggerate both progress and peril is alive, well and dust-coated in your own party. The land itself offers no definitive answers. Rolling hills, occasional trees, and meandering rivers provide markers that are simultaneously reassuring and misleading. One slope may appear modest from afar, yet prove deceptively steep under the weight of wagons. Streams that glint invitingly in the sun are, upon closer inspection, deeper, swifter, or muddier than anticipated. Your gaze flickers between compass, map, and horizon, each offering a subtly different assessment of your proximity to the end. You reflect quietly on historical accounts, noting that pioneers often misjudge distance by a factor of 2, 3, or in rare but dramatic cases, 4. Hope manifests in minor victories. A wagon ascends an incline without mishap. Oxen cooperate for longer stretches than usual, and water is found where none was expected. Yet these successes are tempered by memory. The cumulative weight of previous setbacks, miscalculations, and poor judgment decisions serves as a sobering counterpoint to optimism. One companion mutters quietly, "I feel like we're almost there, but I've been tricked by optimism before." You smile faintly, aware that the sentiment is historically accurate and universally human. The mind begins to play subtle tricks. Dust, fatigue, and monotony combine to create minor hallucinations. A tree may appear to gesture, a distant hill seems to roll toward you, and oxen occasionally look as though they are silently mocking your navigational prowess. Historical diaries suggest this is entirely normal. Exhaustion induces perceptual distortions, which pioneers interpreted as both amusing and slightly alarming. You glance at your own companions, noting that even subtle gestures, a wag of an ox's ear, a swaying branch, acquire narrative weight in the context of prolonged travel. Time, meanwhile, becomes elastic. Miles stretch, minutes expand, and the end, whatever and wherever it is, seems simultaneously imminent and impossibly distant. Conversations are brief, often focused on landmarks that may or may not exist, supplies that are definitively limited, and the vague hope that the next incline will reveal the longed-for edge of settlement. Historical context reassures you. This combination of hope, doubt, and stretched perception is universal, experienced by every pioneer who dared to traverse the final miles of the Oregon Trail. Even minor signs of progress are magnified. A distant chimney, a cloud of smoke, or the faint sound of water, all are interpreted with a mix of hope and caution. Companions exclaim quietly, optimism tempered with the memory of past mirages. That looks promising, but probably isn't. Humor persists in small doses, sarcastic commentary, dry remarks on the deceptive nature of landscapes, and subtle jokes about the final miles of travel provide a gentle buffer against despair. You note with dry amusement that history endorses this combination of hope and humor. The pioneer mind thrives on it. The oxen, ever patient yet subtly judgmental, contribute to this narrative. One steps carefully, another pauses to chew thoughtfully, and a third emits low rumbling sighs that seem to indicate both mild approval and quiet skepticism. Their behavior provides a consistent rhythm, a tactile reassurance amid the uncertainty of distance and progress. You reflect that animals, in their simplicity, often maintain a more consistent assessment of reality than humans, offering both guidance and gentle perspective. Nightfall brings temporary reprieve. Camp is established with care, though supplies are stretched and bodies are weary. Conversations are minimal, often consisting of quiet reflections on distance traveled, terrain navigated, and the uncanny ability of hope to persist even when logic suggests exhaustion. Historical records reinforce the normalcy of these moments. Nearly every diary recounts the mixture of cautious optimism, minor hallucinations, and subtle humor that accompanies the final stretches of the journey. You lie in your bedroll, tired, but reflective, appreciating the consistency of human response across generations. Sleep arrives intermittent and dream-laden. The mind oscillates between hope and doubt, rest and vigilance. Dreams feature wagons teetering, oxen speaking with faintly sarcastic tones, and the subtle, almost imperceptible presence of landmarks that may or may not exist. Historical diaries suggest that such dreams were common. Pioneers processed exhaustion, hope, and minor hallucinations in nocturnal narrative form, finding in sleep both relief and subtle entertainment. You drift off with this comforting realization, aware that the final stretch is simultaneously close and elusive, real and imagined. By morning, you awaken with fingers stiff from minor frostbite, muscles sore from repeated exertion, and a mind strangely attuned to the delicate balance between hope and doubt. The landscape, unchanged yet subtly different with the new light, offers the faint promise of civilization. Every mile feels momentous, every minor victory amplified, and yet the sense of being nearly there remains stubbornly ambiguous. Historical precedent reassures you. This uncertainty is natural, expected, and in retrospect rather entertaining. You rise, tend to oxen, and prepare the wagon for another day. The horizon stretches endlessly, rolling hills interspersed with distant trees and rivers. Yet within this monotony lies a comforting pattern. Human endurance persists, subtle humor mitigates despair, and the ambiguous promise of arrival provides both motivation and narrative continuity. The journey, nearly complete, is at once exhausting and oddly serene, filled with quiet reflection on perseverance, patience, and the subtle art of surviving and occasionally thriving amid uncertainty. By mid-morning, it becomes increasingly clear that your rations are approaching a level of scarcity that could best be described as an existential suggestion of food. Flour has hardened into a form somewhere between dust and brick, dried. Meat is more leather than sustenance and hardtack, while it remains resolutely indestructible, as if mocking your attempts at culinary appreciation. The smell of provisions mingles with dust, sweat, and the faintly bitter aroma of oxen, creating a subtle olfactory reminder that famine, or something like it, is imminent. Your companions respond predictably, though with remarkable subtlety. Hunger manifests as quiet muttering, thinly veiled complaints, and occasional pointedly ironic commentary. A fine repast, someone notes, lifting a piece of hardened meat with deliberate care, the very taste of victory over nature itself. Laughter is muted, brittle but present, a fragile adhesive that holds morale together even as energy wanes. Historical accounts suggest this is typical. Humor, dry and understated, becomes essential when provisions dwindle and exhaustion sets. In the oxen, ever observant, offer subtle commentary through behavior rather than words. They chew steadily, occasionally pause to survey the surroundings, and emit low, rumbling sighs that you interpret as mild judgment. Their stoicism contrasts sharply with human frailty, highlighting the peculiar adaptability of animals in conditions that strain human endurance. In these moments, you quietly acknowledge that the oxen possess more composure than anyone in your party, and likely a more accurate assessment of your prospects. Meals, such as they are, become exercises in endurance and ingenuity. Dried meat is softened with the faintest sprinkle of water. Hardtack is gnawed with dental determination, and flour is converted into a gritty paste of questionable nutritional value. Each bite is accompanied by muted commentary, the occasional sigh, a grimace, or a subtle observation on flavor. Historical diaries frequently note these same phenomena. Pioneers subsisted on remarkably modest diets, cultivating patience, humor, and endurance with every meager morsel. You nod to yourself, quietly marveling at the human capacity for adaptation, however uncomfortable or unpalatable. Hunger has a subtle but persistent effect on morale. Conversations, previously lively or mildly sarcastic, now carry a weight of fatigue and quiet despair. Planning for the next day's travel becomes increasingly pragmatic. How to conserve energy, how to stretch rations, how to coax oxen without provoking outright rebellion. Even minor challenges, loose wagon boards, misaligned wheels, small injuries, feel magnified in their consequences. Yet paradoxically, there is humor in the struggle. Dry, understated amusement at human misfortune persists, even when morale dips precariously low. Historical context offers solace, if only in small doses. Accounts from 1845 describe similar experiences: scarcity of food, prolonged fatigue, and waning spirits. Yet these same records consistently highlight the quiet humor, improvisation, and resilience that emerged from such circumstances. A traveler might write, "We subsisted on hope, dust, and occasional morsels of meat so dry it questioned our understanding of sustenance." You reflect on this, recognizing the pattern. Hunger is a teacher, patience a necessity, and humor the most effective antidote to despair. The psychological effects of scarcity manifest subtly. Companions exhibit minor irritability, lapses in judgment, and a tendency toward hyperbolic commentary on the quality of provisions. Even the most resilient party members find themselves inventing imaginary flavors, recalling meals long past with exaggerated fondness, or trading whispered stories about food in distant settlements. You too participate quietly in this ritual, appreciating both the historical continuity and the gentle absurdity of human hunger. Oxen provide a peculiar sense of stability amid scarcity. Their steady chewing, measured steps, and consistent pace offer reassurance that life in some form persists. In contrast, humans grow increasingly aware of the fragility of morale. Small inconveniences, a toppled water bucket, a stubbed toe, a wagon wheel that refuses to align, are magnified under the lens of hunger. Historical accounts suggest this is normal. The interplay of food scarcity and fatigue produces minor hallucinations, dry humor, and creative problem-solving, all of which sustain travelers until relief, or at least the next meal, appears. Evening brings temporary relief, though rations remain minimal. The oxen are fed, water is distributed, and remaining supplies are rationed with careful precision. The party sits quietly, consuming the last portions of dried meat, hardtack, and flour paste, with careful, deliberate chewing. Conversation revolves around historical precedent, pioneers who survived similarly austere conditions, clever strategies for stretching provisions, and the subtle humor inherent in the absurdity of sustained deprivation. You note with wry appreciation that endurance, humor, and historical perspective are the most reliable tools in the absence of adequate nutrition. Nightfall encourages reflection. The mountains are behind you, the plains stretch ahead, and the oxen breathe gently in the quiet of the camp. Companions lie in their bedrolls, conserving energy, and occasionally muttering commentary on the quality of their meals, the distance traveled, or the moral lesson embedded in hunger. Historical records suggest that these moments of shared endurance, quiet humor, and collective improvisation are foundational to survival. You drift towards sleep, mindful of the scarcity, yet comforted by the persistence of resilience, wit, and the faint promise of future nourishment. As sleep arrives, the mind balances fatigue with imagination. Dreams incorporate both hallucination and memory. Wagons laden with meager provisions, oxen offering subtle critique, companions navigating the final miles with quiet grace or muted exasperation. Hunger persists, but it is tempered by humor, historical perspective, and the collective endurance of your party. The night is a quiet meditation on scarcity, patience, and the subtle absurdity of prolonged travel, in conditions that are simultaneously harsh and instructive. Morning arrives with renewed awareness of limitations and possibilities. The rations are carefully inventoried, supplies reorganized, and oxen tended. Morale, though fragile, is bolstered by small victories. A wheel repaired, a slope navigated without mishap, a minor improvement in weather. Historical context reassures you. Food scarcity, low morale, and occasional hallucinations are predictable companions of the final stretch. Humor, resilience, and careful planning are sufficient to carry you forward, if only step by weary step. By mid-afternoon, when the dust settles into a fine, unrelenting film over every surface, you find yourself holding a piece of jerky, or in the more desperate moments, the leather strap of a harness. It is remarkable how human ingenuity bends to circumstance. Flour has hardened, meat has become texture rather than flavor, and yet somehow the mind, ever resilient, convinces the body that leather is a form of sustenance, chewy, fibrous, and vaguely reminiscent of a proper meal. There is a strange, almost poetic rhythm to the act. Each bite requires careful mastication, deliberation, and the occasional sip of water, measured with the precision of a master apothecary. The flavor, though subtle, carries a hint of nostalgia, dusty, earthy, and tinged with the faint memory of the oxen that have carried you this far. It is a romance born of necessity, a bittersweet recognition that survival often masquerades as culinary adventure. Companions, similarly afflicted, engage in quiet commentary. "I never thought leather could be so nuanced," someone murmurs. Tone dry, eyes squinting in consideration of the subtle textures and occasional grit. Another offers a faintly ironic observation. "It pairs well with dust. Excellent bouquet." These remarks, though understated, are vital. Humor sustains morale, camaraderie persists, and shared hardship fosters a subtle intimacy among the party. Historical diaries corroborate the experience. Pioneers often consumed leather in times of scarcity, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and resignation. One journal entry notes, "We chewed the straps of our harnesses with dignity, reflecting on the ingenuity of survival." Another more succinctly observes, "Leather, though fibrous, preserves character." You nod, appreciating the consistency of human behavior across generations. When sustenance is limited, humor and creativity become as nourishing as calories. The act of chewing leather is meditative. Muscles tire, jaw aches, and yet each chew reinforces the subtle rhythm of survival. You notice the alignment of mind and body. Consciousness focuses on the mechanical act, while imagination wanders to distant homes, imagined feasts, and the faint hope that the next settlement will provide a proper meal. Historical context offers solace. Pioneers understood this duality, blending practicality with reflection, endurance with introspection, and necessity with humor. Oxen, ever perceptive, observe the ritual silently. Their gaze seems to carry faint amusement, as though to remind you that survival can be elegant if one interprets elegance loosely. One ox shifts its weight, chewing in quiet solidarity, reinforcing the notion that endurance is not solitary, that patience and persistence are shared virtues. You consider that even animals participate in the subtle poetry of survival, offering perspective, rhythm, and gentle critique. The sensory experience is oddly complex. Leather, once functional and utilitarian, now acquires a certain romance. Its texture, taste, and resilience mirror the journey itself, fibrous, challenging, occasionally bitter, yet imbued with a quiet satisfaction. Companions nibble on straps, chew jerky, and occasionally produce faint appreciative murmurs. The humor inherent in the activity softens the monotony, creating a gentle rhythm that carries through the afternoon and into early evening. Historical anecdotes provide both context and comfort. One pioneer described chewing leather with a reverence usually reserved for fine wine. Each bite is a meditation on endurance, taste, and the peculiar joy of surviving. Another notes, "Leather nourishes the soul as well as the body if one has imagination." You smile faintly, recognizing that humor, endurance, and imagination are timeless companions for those who traverse difficult, food-scarce terrain. As the sun dips toward the horizon, the act becomes ritualistic. Every chew is deliberate, every swallow considered, and every sigh, whether from fatigue or appreciation, contributes to a shared, quiet narrative. Humor persists, dry and understated, subtle jokes about the flavors of leather, ironic observations about survival, and understated commentary on the creative ways humans convert necessity into sustenance. You realize that the romance lies not in taste, but in the shared experience, in the quiet endurance, and in the gentle recognition of human adaptability. Evening brings reflection. The last morsels are consumed, supplies inventoried, and companions settle into bedrolls, fatigued but quietly reassured by their own resilience. The romance of chewing leather, though absurd to outsiders, becomes a subtle meditation on survival. Patience, endurance, and dry humor provide sustenance for the mind, if not entirely for the body. Historical precedent validates the practice. Generations of pioneers have survived similar deprivation, often recording their experiences with understated wit and gentle philosophical reflection. Night is quiet, broken only by the subtle breathing of oxen, the faint rustle of wagons, and the occasional whispered commentary on the virtues of endurance. Sleep arrives gradually, accompanied by the lingering taste of leather, the memory of shared humor, and the faint hope of proper food in the near future. You drift off, comforted by the knowledge that the act, though humble, is a testament to Human ingenuity, humor, and resilience in the face of scarcity. By morning, reflection continues. Leather chewed the previous day becomes a symbol of accomplishment, a ritual marking endurance, subtle humor, and the delicate balance between necessity and imagination. The wagons are prepared, oxen tended, and the journey forward approached with cautious optimism. Historical diaries reinforce the pattern. Sustenance is as much about attitude, creativity, and humor as it is about calories. And so, with bedrolls packed, leather consumed, and spirits modestly buoyed, you rise to face the next stage of the final stretch. By late afternoon, as the sun begins its gentle descent and the dust settles into a thick, unrelenting film over the wagons, you find yourself walking alongside the last ox. Its breath is warm, steady, and faintly pungent, a combination of hay, dust, sweat, and something that defies classification. The smell is remarkable in its constancy, unchanging despite days, perhaps weeks, of hardship. It is both grounding and oddly comforting, a reminder that life persists even when conditions are hostile and morale is low. The human spirit, you reflect, has a subtle yet remarkable resilience. You are tired, dusty, and painfully aware of the limitations imposed by hunger, fatigue, and relentless terrain, yet somehow you keep moving. Every careful step, every adjustment of wagons, every coaxing word to the oxen is an act of endurance, ingenuity, and quiet persistence. Historical accounts describe the same phenomenon. Pioneers, even in the face of scarcity, misadventure, and exhaustion, continued forward with remarkable, often understated determination. The spirit, it seems, thrives not in comfort, but in measured response to adversity. There is humor in the experience, dry and understated. The smell of the last ox, though overwhelming at times, is described in diaries with wry amusement. Its odor is both life-affirming and morally instructive, one entry notes. Another remarks, "We have grown accustomed to the fragrance which accompanies us faithfully, regardless of misfortune or minor catastrophe." You acknowledge with a faint smile that survival is rarely heroic in the cinematic sense. It is quiet, steady, and often absurd. A gentle ballet of patience, observation, and endurance. Walking alongside the ox, you notice subtle signs of companionship. The animal moves predictably, responds to gentle guidance, and offers a steady presence in a landscape that remains indifferent. There is reassurance in the constancy of life. Oxen, dust, wagons, and companions all provide a rhythm to which the human spirit can align itself. Each step reinforces a meditation on survival. Resilience, humor, and careful attention to circumstance are as essential as food, water, or navigational skill. Historical precedent continues to provide comfort. Diaries and letters from travelers of the Oregon Trail repeatedly emphasize the importance of steady perseverance. One journal recounts, "We walked alongside our oxen, reflecting on the nature of endurance, the passage of time, and the peculiar joys of shared misfortune." Another observes, "In the smell of animals, in the grind of wheels, and in the rhythm of travel, we discovered both humor and fortitude." You consider the subtle irony of these statements. Adversity, discomfort, and minor catastrophe are often the catalysts for reflection, humor, and quiet endurance. The landscape stretches before you, monotonous yet beautiful in its subtlety. Rolling plains and distant ridges provide both challenge and perspective. Each mile is a testament to perseverance, each step a marker of human ingenuity and animal cooperation. Humor persists, dry and understated, even as fatigue gnaws at limbs and morale. Companions offer quiet commentary, stories of past mistakes and reflections on the bizarre romance of survival. You too contribute subtly, acknowledging the absurdity and beauty of the journey in equal measure. Nightfall approaches, and the smell of the last ox blends with the lingering dust, faint campfire smoke, and the residual aroma of dried provisions. It is not unpleasant, at least not entirely, but it is undeniably present, a sensory anchor linking past, present, and immediate necessity. You breathe deeply, accepting the discomfort as part of the narrative, and reflect on the lessons inherent in survival: patience, humility, humor, and the remarkable capacity of humans to endure, adapt, and find amusement, even in trying circumstances. Food scarcity, misadventures, misjudged shortcuts, and the relentless dust now recede slightly into memory. What remains is the rhythm of life on the trail, oxen breathing, wagons creaking, companions murmuring quietly, and a human mind attuned to the delicate interplay of endurance, humor, and observation. Survival, it seems, is as much about perspective as provision. Historical precedent supports this reflection. Diaries from the period describe the interplay of hardship, humor, and perseverance with subtle appreciation, often accompanied by faintly sarcastic commentary on circumstance. As darkness settles, the final stretch continues in quiet meditation. You lie in your bedroll, listening to the soft snorts of oxen, the rustle of wagons settling, and the faint whisper of companions drifting into sleep. Your mind wanders across reflections of history, imagination, and personal endurance, all anchored by the constant presence of the last ox, whose smell, rhythm, and patient indifference provide a subtle, enduring comfort. Humor persists, dry and understated, a gentle counterpoint to fatigue, hunger, and the persistent challenge of the trail. Sleep arrives slowly, dream-laden and reflective. Dreams intertwine memory and imagination. Wagons teetering gently, oxen chewing thoughtfully, companions whispering sardonic commentary, and the subtle awareness of survival in its most elemental form. The human spirit, tested by distance, scarcity, and minor misadventure, endures. Humor, observation, and quiet reflection provide sustenance as reliable as any meal, grounding the body and mind in preparation for the final miles yet to come. Morning promises continuation. The horizon stretches endlessly, the smell of the last ox remains steadfast, and the human spirit, resilient and slightly amused, rises to meet the challenges ahead. Reflection, humor, endurance, and subtle appreciation of absurdity form the foundation of survival. Every step, every mile, and every gentle sigh of the ox reinforces a truth both simple and profound. Humans persevere, adapt, and endure, and in doing so, create stories that are at once absurd, humorous, and quietly inspiring. The final morning of your journey begins with an awareness that is both exhilarating and terrifying. You are within reach of Oregon, or at least the concept of Oregon. The air carries a faint promise of rivers, trees, and the faint aroma of civilization, though tempered by dust, sweat, and a lingering undertone of oxen musk. Every step forward is heavy with anticipation and exhaustion, the wagon wheels groaning under a mixture of cargo, fatigue, and accumulated despair. You stagger, not walk over the uneven terrain, muscles protesting in a chorus of groans and subtle muttering. The companions beside you move with similar hesitance, faces pale, eyes squinting, and an unspoken agreement that the human body has limits, most of which you exceeded long ago. Yet despite the tattered clothing, blistered feet, and general state of mild disrepair, there is triumph. Triumph tempered with disbelief, joy laced with relief, and a quietly chaotic sense that survival, against all odds, is somehow yours. Historical accounts frequently describe this moment with remarkable understatement. Diaries recount settlers arriving in Oregon with exhaustion etched into every line of their face, clothes torn or patched, and belongings reduced to the bare essentials. The sentiment is universal, relief mingled with disbelief, exhaustion tempered by satisfaction, and a subtle awareness that the journey, though arduous, has been endured. You nod, dust-coated and mildly delirious, appreciating the continuity of human experience across generations. The oxen, silent and patient, continue their slow, deliberate pace. They have borne the brunt of the journey, endured the dust, mud, rivers, and cliffs, and now trudge forward with stoic resolve. Their presence is oddly grounding, a reminder that survival is shared, that endurance is not solitary, and that history has always been accompanied by the subtle but persistent judgment of animals. You glance at the last ox, sniffing the air, nostrils flaring faintly, as though commenting on the absurdity of human triumph, and you smile weakly, recognizing a kindred spirit in its unspoken wisdom. Companions offer quiet exclamations, sporadic laughter, and intermittent groans of disbelief. Each step forward is an act of celebration, of endurance, and of quiet acknowledgement that the landscape, ever indifferent, has been mastered, temporarily at least, by sheer stubbornness, ingenuity, and a thin veneer of optimism. Historical. Diaries often emphasize this paradox. Arrival is joyous, yet the memory of suffering lingers, flavoring triumph with exhaustion and subtle incredulity. You, tattered and spiritually unhinged, resonate fully with this sentiment. The land itself shifts subtly as you approach the edges of settlement. Trees grow taller, rivers flow more consistently, and the distant smoke of cabins or farms signals that civilization has not entirely abandoned the continent. Each landmark is magnified in significance: a bend in the river, a familiar grove, or the first sight of a constructed fence evokes emotional resonance far beyond its intrinsic value. Companions point quietly, offer muted commentary, and sometimes emit small incredulous laughter, reactions perfectly aligned with historical precedent. You notice minor hallucinations persist, as expected after weeks of dust, hunger, and exhaustion. A tree appears to gesture, a distant ox seems to wink, and shadows dance across the landscape in subtle, playful patterns. Historical sources suggest this is normal. The mind, pushed to extremes, blends reality, hope, and imagination, producing a narrative in which triumph and absurdity coexist. You quietly appreciate the poetic quality of this delirium, finding in it a strangely comforting validation of shared human experience. The final steps into Oregon are ceremonial in their subtlety. Nothing heralds your arrival with trumpet or fanfare. Instead, it is marked by a gradual realization that the wagon wheels roll on familiar, stable soil, that oxen step without hesitation, and that companions pause, exhausted but alert, to survey a landscape that is, at last, conquered. The triumph is quiet, internal, and profoundly understated, reflecting the cumulative endurance of countless miles, innumerable hardships, and a journey that has reshaped both body and mind. You stagger into the settlement, if indeed stagger can be distinguished from crawl, muscles trembling, clothes tattered, and face smeared with dust, sweat, and minor injuries accumulated over months. Spirits, though frayed, remain resilient. There is a sense of achievement, subtle pride, and the faint acknowledgement that history, in all its dusty, chaotic glory, has been lived firsthand. Companions echo this sentiment quietly, each recognizing in the others a shared near-mystical understanding of human perseverance. The townspeople, observing your arrival, may offer a faintly startled glance, a muted welcome, or a subtle nod of respect. They do not fully appreciate the nuances of survival, the cumulative weight of dust, hunger, and minor calamity that has shaped your being. Yet their presence underscores the completion of a monumental journey. Historical accounts suggest that settlers often arrive to curious, bemused, and occasionally critical observers, a combination that you now find oddly reassuring. At the edge of town, you pause, taking in the scenery, inhaling the relatively fresh air, and reflecting on the improbable reality you are here. The oxen chew quietly, companions shift uncomfortably in the aftermath of triumph, and the landscape seems in its quietude to acknowledge both human endurance and the absurdity of the journey itself. The moment is triumphant, tattered, and spiritually unhinged, exactly as history predicted. Now that the dust has settled, literally and metaphorically, you find yourself in a strange reflective state. The wagons are unloaded, the oxen rested, and companions are dispersed in various stages of exhaustion and quiet contemplation. You lean against a tree, feeling the uneven bark beneath your palms, and allow yourself the luxury of looking back over the months of hardship, missteps, and minor catastrophes. You realize, with a gentle and unsettling clarity, that the sum total of what you have learned is remarkably little. All the meticulous planning, map consulting, and discussions about shortcuts seem, in retrospect, to have amounted to the same thing as a game of dice played in the dark. You nod knowingly, a small smile forming, acknowledging the absurdity of human ambition. Survival, it appears, was less about wisdom or preparation, and more about stubbornness, occasional luck, and the willingness to chew old leather without complaint. This insight is comforting in a dry, slightly sardonic way. Your companions, equally reflective, nod faintly, muttering agreement in low tones. One observes, "I suppose if we learned anything, it's that dust adheres to everything regardless of effort." Another adds with subtle irony, "and that oxen have judgment beyond their years." Laughter is quiet but present, a soft punctuation that underscores both relief and the faint absurdity of months spent trudging westward under duress. Historical diaries confirm the sentiment. Pioneers frequently noted that the journey taught them surprisingly little, at least in terms of practical skill, while leaving an indelible imprint of endurance, humor, and minor trauma. You reflect on the smaller lessons, the ones not captured in maps, journals, or carefully crafted itineraries. Patience, for example, emerges as a central theme. Patience to wait for oxen to move, patience to navigate mud, rivers, and cliffs, and patience to chew leather in silence without complaint. Yet even this lesson is delivered with subtle irony. The patience you cultivated was reactive, enforced by circumstance, and often tested to the very brink of endurance. It is, in short, a lesson both valuable and absurd, as fleeting as the dust on your boots. Hope, too, seems to have been a lesson. Perhaps not in the conventional sense, but in a quiet, unspoken way. The ability to continue moving despite fatigue, dwindling supplies, and the occasional hallucination proves itself invaluable. You nod, appreciating that history corroborates your personal experience. Hope, however intermittent and occasionally delusional, was the lifeblood of pioneer travel. It is comforting to know that centuries of travelers relied on exactly the same resilience, dust-coated humor and fragile optimism that carried you this far. The body, predictably, reminds you of its limits. Sore muscles, blistered feet, and minor injuries accumulate into a subtle but persistent ache, a reminder that survival came at a cost. Yet there is quiet satisfaction in the ache, a gentle recognition that the effort, the endurance, and the minor suffering were not entirely wasted. They were, in a paradoxically cozy sense, validating, proof that the human spirit, however absurdly tested, is capable of persistence in the face of near-constant adversity. Companions, in their own quiet ways, provide similar reflections. One wanders to inspect the last ox, muttering a gentle acknowledgement of the animal's patience and quiet judgment. Another examines a battered wagon wheel, commenting dryly on the futility of certain mechanical improvements. Even minor disagreements are softened by the collective understanding that survival, humor, and endurance outweigh precision, mastery, or achievement. Historical diaries suggest this pattern is universal. Pioneers, arriving in Oregon or elsewhere, were rarely filled with profound insights. Instead, they were quietly content, mildly relieved, and subtly amused by the absurdity of it all. There is a curious comfort in realizing that learning nothing is, in itself, a form of knowledge. The subtle absurdity of months spent navigating rivers, mud, dust, and poor maps, coupled with persistent hunger, minor injuries, and hallucinations, produces a quiet wisdom. That human endurance thrives not on mastery, but on adaptation, improvisation, and humor. You find this realization soothing, an acknowledgement that the journey was valuable, even if conventional lessons were sparse. The landscape, calm and indifferent, reinforces this sense of peace. Trees sway gently in the breeze, rivers trickle quietly, and the distant hum of human activity provides reassurance that the world continues, unaffected by your personal misadventures. The oxen graze calmly, companions move with deliberate slowness, and the air, though tinged with the lingering odor of hard work and travel, carries a faint promise of comfort. You lie back, absorbing the quiet, reflecting on months of effort, and recognize that the greatest lesson is perhaps that survival, humor, and patience often outweigh conventional knowledge. Evening settles gently. Shadows stretch long, companions retreat to bedrolls, and the soft creaking of wagons echoes faintly in memory. You reflect on the journey with a sense of subtle amusement, the innumerable missteps, minor disasters and absurdities that characterized every mile, now reframed as stories, anecdotes, and lessons in resilience. Nothing of immediate practical value has been gained, yet the experience, the endurance, humor, and shared absurdity has produced a quiet, enduring satisfaction. As night arrives, you settle beneath a tree, bedroll beneath you, body tired but mind at ease. The realization that nothing has been learned is softened by the cozy rhythm of completion. Dust settles, companions rest, and oxen breathe quietly. Dreams intermingle with memory, humor, and faint hallucination. Wagons teeter, leather is chewed. Maps lie folded in the dust, and the subtle absurdity of months past is celebrated silently in the mind's eye. Historical diaries validate the experience. Pioneers arrived with little formal learning, yet a profound sense of accomplishment, humor, and endurance accompanied them into rest. You drift into sleep with quiet contentment, comforted by the knowledge that learning nothing was in fact precisely what you needed. Survival, humor, patience, and subtle absurdity, these were the truest lessons, repeated across generations, dust-coated and unassuming, yet entirely sufficient. Even as you settle beneath the tree, dust still clinging to every exposed surface, your mind wanders to the countless others who made the journey before you, actual settlers who traversed the same rivers, plains, and mountains, with oxen, wagons, and far less entertainment than you've enjoyed in reflection. Their lives, recorded in diaries, letters, and occasionally the faintly sarcastic comments of historians, reveal a pattern that is at once familiar and oddly comforting. Survival, yes, true, but endless complaint inevitably. One such account describes a party arriving in Oregon after months on the trail. They write, with understated exasperation, about dust in every conceivable crevice, the monotony of endless plains, and oxen that seem to have acquired a most disagreeable disposition. You nod, recognizing the resonance. Your own oxen, though mildly more philosophical, have demonstrated the same quiet judgment, and the dust, well, you can still taste it in the corners of your mouth. Historical continuity, it seems, is as much about complaints as it is about survival. Complaints in these diaries cover a remarkable spectrum. Food is almost universally cited. Dried, meat, hardtack, flour paste, all consumed with varying degrees of resignation and irony. One settler writes, "We subsisted on substances that mocked both palate and patience." Another, more poetic, notes, "Hunger sharpened wit more than teeth, yet both remained keen." You appreciate the subtle humor. The pioneers, much like yourself, relied on dry wit to navigate scarcity, absurdity, and the occasional existential dread. Weather is another frequent subject of grumbling. Rain, snow, heat, and relentless wind are catalogued meticulously, with faintly ironic commentary on the persistence of natural forces. The rain, one diary observes, falls in mockery of our planning, patience, and footwear. Another complains that snow added a sense of novelty to travel, mostly unpleasant. You smile, recognizing that these complaints mirror your own internal monologue over rivers, dust, and poorly conceived shortcuts. Diseases, injuries, and minor disasters are catalogued with a similar blend of morbidity and humor. Diaries recount cholera outbreaks, frostbite, and minor accidents with a wry, understated tone. One writer notes, "The oxen survived better than some of us, which is both reassuring and unsettling." Another reflects, "We endured minor calamities with dignity, though often with tears and muttered expletives." There is an unmistakable continuity. Survival is intertwined with complaint, humor, and the subtle acknowledgement that endurance is not a quiet, dignified affair. Social dynamics, unsurprisingly, feature prominently in settler complaints. Arguments over routes, rationing, and leadership are common, with commentary that is dry, cutting, and historically consistent. Half the party wished for shortcuts, the other half for actual sense, one diary observes. Another notes, disagreement proved as frequent as dust and equally pervasive. You chuckle quietly. recalling your own minor disputes, the subtle sarcastic commentary of companions, and the remarkable patience required to manage the collective personality of a wagon train. Historical precedent reassures you. Human behavior on the trail has changed little, aside from clothing styles and minor hygiene, yet even in complaint there is insight. Settlers who survived, and many did despite odds, demonstrate remarkable ingenuity, endurance, and humor. Complaints serve not only as catharsis, but also as subtle instruction, how to navigate scarcity, illness, weather, and unreliable maps. Diaries, though full of exasperation, reveal strategies, improvisation, and quiet triumphs. You, tattered and dust-coated, recognize the same patterns. Humor, endurance, and adaptability are the constants. Complaint merely the seasoning. Some records are almost affectionate in their sarcasm. One settler writes, "I complain because it is my duty. I endure because it is necessary." Another notes, "If we emerge with sanity intact, it will be by luck and coffee, neither of which were abundant." You smile, appreciating the lineage of dry wit. Complaints are timeless, endurance universal, and the absurdity of prolonged travel is a shared heritage. Historical reflection in this sense is both comforting and validating. You are part of a continuum of human stubbornness, perseverance, and polite, persistent grumbling. Minor victories are punctuated with complaint as well. One diary recounts the joy of crossing a river without incident, immediately followed by reflection on the mud, wet clothes, and faintly panicked oxen. Another celebrates the sight of distant mountains, only to add, "They appear closer than they are," which is cruel. You recognize this subtle pattern. Every triumph is accompanied by context, humor, and acknowledgement of cost. Your own arrival in Oregon, triumphant yet tattered and spiritually unhinged, mirrors this pattern precisely. As you recline beneath your chosen tree, companions nearby, you consider the strange comfort of historical resonance. These settlers, though exhausted, hungry, and inclined to complaint, share a perspective that transcends centuries. Survival is arduous, humor is essential, and enduring hardship produces both stories and quiet pride. The realization is cozy in a peculiar dust-coated way. Human nature has remained remarkably consistent, and you are now part of that story, complaining and enduring alongside ancestors you may never meet. Night falls gently. The wagons are unloaded. Oxen rest and companions lie in bedrolls, murmuring quietly about food, fatigue, and minor grievances. You reflect with mild amusement that the complaints of settlers past are not so different from your own. Dust in boots, leather chewed with, ironic reverence and subtle hallucinations, all part of the experience. Historical diaries assure you that this is normal, expected, and oddly comforting. Survival is intertwined with complaint, humor, and endurance, forming a narrative that stretches across time, space, and countless dusty miles. Sleep comes slowly, but peacefully, punctuated by faint sighs of companions, the distant rustle of wildlife, and the soft breathing of oxen. In dreams, you wander past the wagons, across rivers and over plains, accompanied by ghostly voices of settlers past, offering quiet commentary, subtle sarcasm, and gentle historical insight. Complaints mingle with triumphs, humor with endurance, and the subtle absurdity of the journey persists even in rest. Morning arrives, faint light filtering through the leaves of your tree. You lie for a moment, savoring the serenity, reflecting on months of misadventure, and acknowledging the lineage of endurance, humor, and complaint that has carried countless travelers to this point. Historical reflection reinforces the comfort. Settlers arrived, survived, and grumbled. You have arrived, survived, and grumbled. The pattern, quietly timeless, is satisfying in its predictability. Finally, at last, you allow yourself the smallest, most unguarded indulgence: rest. Not the carefully measured rest of a scheduled break, nor the pragmatic pause between chores, but full, absolute, unashamed collapse. You lie down beneath a broad, forgiving tree bedroll arranged or mostly arranged beneath your weary body. The ground is uneven, roots pressing gently against ribs and elbows, but it is yours. The air, now less dust-laden than weeks past, carries a faint sweetness of pine, earth, and the occasional distant river, a melody to which your lungs respond with a grateful sigh. You are probably lying on your face. Perhaps it is a reflection of exhaustion, perhaps an aesthetic choice influenced by months of dust, sweat, and subtle hallucinations. The dirt presses against your cheeks, the sun warms your back, and somewhere in the near distance, oxen chew quietly, mildly approving, mildly judgmental. Companions lie scattered nearby, murmuring softly in dreams, each in their own state of tattered triumph and subtle delirium. Historical records confirm the final rest of the Oregon Trail is rarely elegant. It is sprawling, chaotic, and deeply deserved. The mind, untethered for the first time in months, drifts gently. Memories of rivers crossed, plains trudged, mountains climbed, and shortcuts regretted mingle with minor hallucinations. Fragments of conversation and the faint scent of leather. The human spirit, persistently tested, now finds solace in inertia. You allow yourself to be carried by the rhythm of breathing oxen, the whisper of leaves overhead, and the subtle comfort of having survived, however tattered and spiritually unhinged. Every detail becomes soothing, almost hypnotic. The creak of a distant wagon, the gentle sigh of a companion adjusting in sleep, the faint hum of wind through the branches. These are now your lullabies. Dust no longer irritates, it merely coats surfaces as a reminder of shared experience. Blisters throb quietly but predictably, serving as a tactile affirmation that the journey is complete. Historical diaries repeatedly underscore this paradox. Physical discomfort persists even in moments of repose, yet it is tempered by the incomparable satisfaction of endurance, humor, and the quiet absurdity of survival. You think of the oxen, noble and stoic companions through mud, rivers, and plains of relentless dust. Their gaze, calm and unjudging, feels like subtle approval. They are both witnesses and participants, silent arbiters of a journey that tested patience, humor, and the limits of human persistence. Leaning face down into the gentle slope of grass and dirt, you feel their presence, a comforting reminder that endurance is shared and that the absurdity of months-long travel has been mutually acknowledged. Companions, too, add texture to the moment. One murmurs in their sleep, perhaps a fragment of a complaint, perhaps a dream about leather or hardtack. Another stirs slightly, the faint creak of a bedroll echoing across the quiet clearing. These gentle sounds, far from intrusive, provide reassurance. You are not alone in exhaustion. Triumph, tattered though it may be, is communal. Historical context reassures you. Pioneers often noted the comfort of simply being in the company of others who had survived, laughed, and complained through the same ordeal. The sky, gradually shifting in color as afternoon wanes, becomes a gentle backdrop. Sunlight filters through branches, highlighting dust motes suspended in the air, giving them a faint, almost magical glow. You notice the subtle poetry. Months of hardship have produced this moment of quiet wonder, a tableau in which survival, humor, and absurdity coalesce into serene beauty. Even the smell of the last ox, faintly pungent, becomes oddly comforting, a reminder of companionship, toil, and the tangible reality of shared endeavor. You reflect gently and without grandiosity on the journey's absurdity. Every mistake, every shortcut regretted, every river feared and conquered, every bite of hardened meat or chewed leather, all have led to this unremarkable, profoundly satisfying moment of repose. You acknowledge, with a subtle smile, that the Oregon Trail offers few lessons in conventional wisdom, yet it provides abundant insight into endurance, creativity, and human adaptability. The knowledge, though intangible, is deeply nourishing. Sleep arrives slowly, not with dramatic finality, but as a gentle creeping tide. Muscles relax, mind drifts, and the weight of months-long vigilance dissolves gradually. Dreams intermingle with memory, rivers shimmer faintly in hallucinated light, oxen murmur philosophical commentary, and companions navigate the plains of subconscious with the same dry humor and quiet resilience you observed in waking hours. Historical accounts confirm the legitimacy of such dreams. They are the mind's gentle acknowledgement of the journey, a final act of storytelling, reflection, and humor before rest claims full dominion. Night deepens, crickets chirp faintly, leaves rustle and distant stars emerge, indifferent to human triumph and folly alike. You, probably face down, breathe slowly, sensing the subtle rhythm of the earth beneath you. Companions shift softly, the oxen murmur in their sleep, and all is quiet except for the persistent, comforting presence of survival itself. It is a quiet symphony of endurance. Dust, leather, complaint, and triumph merging into the gentle cadence of rest. Morning may or may not arrive in your immediate consciousness. The point you reflect in muffled thought is not in arrival, but in this moment. Lying beneath the tree, face to the dirt, heart quietly proud, humor intact, body tattered, and spirit unhinged yet content. Historical precedent is clear. Pioneers rarely left the trail untouched, and you, like them, are perfectly imperfect, thoroughly exhausted, yet undeniably alive. And so, finally, with subtle satisfaction, gentle humor, and a faint trace of oxen, musk you sleep. The Oregon Trail in all its dusty, absurd, challenging glory is behind you. Your body rests, your mind drifts, and the tree above offers its quiet, unassuming comfort. The journey is complete. You are complete. And as the historical record would note with polite understatement, you are ready, perhaps for the first time in months, to do nothing at all.